Once upon a time in the kingdom of Ubera, by the power of the spirit of light, the sun was published. And by controlling the darkness, the spirit controller Freed brings the night. While Millionaire provides life energy, Freedy prepares to rest. Millionaire illuminates the world with a warm light. Meanwhile, Freed shaded it with a shady shadow. Such is the world, including the Ubera Empire formed by their hands. Today, the Millionaire imperial family and the special and charming Archduke Freed family are irreplaceable figures who can control spirits. In the royal palace of Ubera, in a huge royal building with its impressive architecture, the weather is sunny with lots of greenery. Everything is blooming. Everything is bright green. Inside the palace, the light passed through the window. There were many plants in the room. Everything is well maintained with greens and browns. A girl with light golden hair and bright blue eyes was sitting in the hall. She was wearing a blue uniform with a ribbon tied in her hair. He sat on a chair reading a book while thinking hard. That's not even funny. That girl's name is Dorothea. She is the princess of the Ubera kingdom. There was a boy who approached her and called her Dorothea, but she did not respond. So the boy kept calling her. She is irritated and finally tells him not to make a fuss. He called him Ray. After those words, he got up and went somewhere. The boy looked and did not understand where he was moving. He followed her around. He wanted to apologize. She asked him if he was too noisy. He asks her not to get angry as he will be quiet. Dorothea reflected on what was so annoying around her at the moment. He didn't even know how she could address him so pitifully. The boy's name is Raymond Millionaire. He is a boy who always smiles the same way. He has bright golden hair and bright blue eyes. He still follows her. He went around offering Dorothea to go with him. He is the prince of the kingdom of Ubera, and the obnoxious and stupid older brother of Dorothea. Dorothea looked at him with displeasure at his interruption. He was the legitimate crown prince who once died by his own hands. And this is his second life, a last chance for the former tyrant. He would not repeat the same regrets a second time. That is his current life goal. He wants to live well. The lesson from his first life is that good defeats evil. But there he is, the evil one. In her past life, Dorothea was seen carrying a sword and bloodied clothes. She stood in front of Raymond, who was sprawled on the floor and covered in blood. She killed her own brother to get the throne. She killed the crown prince to usurp the title of emperor. Kill all who oppose it, and only share wealth with the power of those who are after his heart. But everything was destroyed after she had everything. The man she loved hated her and chose to die. The people she gave power turned to choke their own throats. People call her a tyrant. They burned her palace and called for her death. This life lesson was enough for her. And that's how he accepted her own death. Dorothea opened her eyes. She faintly heard a rhetorical question mentioning how she looked so beautiful. She didn't understand what they were talking about. Now she is called princess. She is Dorothea Millionaire, the tyrant reborn. Maybe it was a lesson for her. Lesson to live right. It was a chance to mend his life of crime and regret. Ray's murder to win the title of emperor was the beginning of the emergence of the tyrant Dorothea Millionaire and all her regrets. So he couldn't kill her anymore. He will not love her, and have to put up with all his behavior. Ray hugged Dorothea from behind. He asked her if she was reading a difficult book again. It seemed Dorothea was a real genius. She said that Dorothea was so small and cute, she wondered how she could be so smart too. While in Dorothea's head there was a desire to just kill her. He asks her to let him in. She kisses his cheek. Dan says that his Dorothea is so cute, so already Dorothea did not like him. He's not that sensitive. He still asked to let him in. She reflects that she never loved Ray. She told him to better learn the history of Ubera on his own. He neglected to say that he was not as smart as Dorothea. From Dorothea's point of view, her brother had nothing in his head. But he had everything just because of that crown prince title. He asked with a big smile. Doesn't he get tired of sitting all day? Dorothea thought she got more than she did just because he was born a prince. He invited her to go play. He was surprised that he was so peaceful and replied that he would not go. If he wants to go, then let him go alone. He wouldn't give up and said that he wanted to play with her. A servant comes and tells His Highness the Prince that it is impossible to distract the princess during her studies. He became sad. The maid saw the book in Dorothea's hand and was surprised. She asked her if she had studied the history of Ubera. She bent down to take a look and said it seemed it was about the light spirit stone. The maid then asked if she knew that the spirit stone that the first emperor had was lost during Teresia's time. Dorothea refers to the maid as the nanny and says that she was wrong because the light spirit stone disappeared at that moment. And after all, there is a difference of almost 100 years between the eras of Teresa and Croesus. The nanny was already confused by the historical background of the kingdom, while her brother is happy that Dorothea is so cool. The nurse asked her if she had learned anything about the millionaire family. How can she be so smart? Dorothea was sorry and thought it showed. She should feign ignorance. The governess stated that His Majesty the Emperor was only obliged to hear about his knowledge. Dorothea was surprised by his words like that. The nurse said that there was no need to report to His Majesty the Emperor. Emperor Karnan Millionaire, in other words, was his father. To him, the word father seemed foreign, as if it came from a language he did not know. He only knows the translation, but do not understand the true meaning, even if it is flesh and blood. He meant nothing to Dorothea, because he couldn't afford to inherit the millionaire family. His mother, Empress Alice, died after giving birth to him. Karnan ignored him because his birth caused the death of his beloved wife. He used to try desperately to attract Karnan's attention. He pretended to fall and try to show intelligence. He tries hard to be better than Ray, but he never paid any heed to it. But Ray was different from him. Without doing anything, he was rewarded and was able to eat with Karnan. Karnan could smile just with all the questions from him. Why does he love Ray, who is stupid, careless, and doesn't know anything more? Why did he try so hard? Just ignore it. Is it because he was not elected? Dorothea hated Raymond. She really hates him. He was only satisfied after seizing everything he had. A glass fell on the floor and broke. She ends up attacking Ray. She was stopped by the maid. She could only rest easy when he tortured her properly and took her things. The father, with a hateful look, gave orders to lock Dorothea in the room for a month. And the further their relationship. The longer his relationship with Karnan, the worse. He just wants to be loved, but his life is not worth loving. Like a bat misses the moon. Her love is always one-sided and unrequited. That's how his anger and hatred grow the seeds of evil. Envy and envy. Arbitrary, greedy and greedy. Everything continues after the arrival of the tyrant Dorothea Millionaire, even though all those reasons are meaningless now. Now he realized that blaming others for his sins was meaningless. It must be because he was the one who was wrong for not being sweet. Now it doesn't matter. He no longer hoped for Karnan. In fact, it's not bad to live without this shadow. Living well is also comfortable. Back to the present. Dorothea was still reading a book. While Dorothea was contemplating what to read to her, the nurse stood beside her and thought that the emperor would surely be delighted to see the princess he longed for. It's very sunny and warm today outside. Dorothea was walking in the garden with the nurse. The nurse suggested he take a walk somewhere. He pointed a direction. Today, to relax a bit, the maid pointed to the garden, which was surrounded by a fence and full of all kinds of plants and greenery. Dorothea, who saw that, was immediately shocked and fell silent when she saw it. It was a garden made by Karnan for his wife, Alice, who missed her hometown. In his previous life, he also used to go there often. Been a long time. But why suddenly the nanny took him there? Dorothea wondered. And when the two of them were walking in the garden, suddenly they heard a servant greet His Majesty the Emperor. Dorothea turned and saw her father clearly. It could be seen from him that he was also unhappy to see the princess. He looked at her sullenly. Dorothea immediately grew alert and wondered if she had done something stupid that was no worse than Ray. If he is not polite, maybe he has done something wrong. What should he say? Finally, Karnan asked a question. Who are they who dare to enter Alice's garden? Hearing Karnan's voice, the princess thought that she was right. Can he hope to live life in a good way? Karnan asked who they were. As they dared to enter Alice's garden, the maid told him that this is Dorothea Millionaire's daughter. All he thought about was bringing his hand to his chin and quietly saying that was crazy. Dorothea heard and repeated his sentence in her head. She looked at him politely and reproached him for not even being able to greet him properly. Then he asked if he had not been taught. That Dorothea watched in his head. That this is true, because he didn't have parents who would teach him. The servant frantically said that there was no way for His Majesty. He claimed that the princess was very smart and extraordinary. Karnan replied that he had doubts, because to him she looks like a little and impudent girl. The nurse tried her best to defend daughter Dorothea, in saying that it was probably only because the princess was surprised to meet him for the first time, because he shone in the etiquette class in the palace. Then he turned to Dorothea with a question. Is not that true? Then Dorothea seemed to exhale, and she started walking towards Karnan and bowed her head and body slightly while holding the hem of her dress with both hands. He greeted His Imperial Highness Millionaire very politely. The emperor asked him how old he was. The princess, who was still bowing, replied that she was 8 years old this year. He again continued the interrogation, asking what his exclusivity was. He raised his head, saying that this was just an exaggeration. From the nurse, there is nothing extraordinary about her. The nurse suddenly interrupts them, saying that it is because of Her Majesty to see the princess is simple and perceptive beyond her years. And he had studied the entire imperial lineage, but the princess was annoyed that there was absolutely no help from the maids. The emperor bowed after his words. He asked if it was true that he had studied the millionaire family lineage. So he said by testing that, if it was true, then let him tell. The princess confidently replied that the emperor must have known the royal lineage. Was there really something he didn't know about in the millionaire family tree? He aggressively asks if she really decided to check it out. The maid stood silently and awkwardly between them. The princess replied that apparently it was Her Highness who was testing her. What was the use of him telling the family tree here? He also didn't interrupt and ask, so he refused the emperor's order. In the nurse's eyes, it looked like a den of beasts. The princess finally said that she was just trying to save time. His Highness was right that he was so busy that he had never seen him since his birth. The emperor folded his arms over his chest, saying that because of that he would tell the genealogy of the royal family, only if it will benefit him. Dorothea replied that she just didn't want to waste her time. The emperor thought about it and finally said that since the nurse's words were true, then in that case he asked Dorothea to say if there was anything she wanted to say. Dorothea was surprised she didn't understand to say what she wanted. What was that for? Because within her memory, the emperor had never said such a thing to her. He suspected she was up to something. He is still silent. He pondered that before rebirth he would jump for joy. But sadly she doesn't need anything from him now. He himself could not remain silent. He finally asked in this regard to make him the best wine with his name. He decided to ask for something that could play in his hand in the future. The emperor immediately became gloomy. He turned to the nurse and asked what she was teaching this child. Here is it appropriate for a child of this age to say such a thing? He made excuses that he never talked about alcohol in front of the princess. Then the princess intervened and said that it was not the nurse who taught her. He read about it in a book called Babalua Paintings. He said that there is a scene where Babalua and her lover are very happy to drink classic wine, described by the author as something very subtle. Hence, out of curiosity, he wanted to try a good quality wine at least once. The emperor was surprised by this answer because such a young girl read such a difficult Babalua painting. He thought about it and finally agreed. Dan said that since he wanted a fine wine with his name, then it would be prepared. So he set a condition, that if he made a mistake at least once, he would punish his nurse who lied to him to death. He gave an order to tell the family's imperial family tree. He lowered his head and pondered that perhaps he had inherited the tyrannical nature of his father. He finally said it was fine. And then he would start mentioning the first-generation millionaire family leader, because Dorothea was determined to live well. He had to protect his nanny's life. After that incident, the nurse hoped that the emperor would start caring for Dorothea. But Karnan never visited him at all. The maid called him a bad thing, but the emperor was the father of the princess. He couldn't come to her because he must be very busy with work. From what she heard from her nanny, Dorothea was just acting normal. He even told his nanny not to grieve. Moreover, Karnan wasn't that kind of person. Even though the nanny always loved her, she was actually grateful. Dorothea was actually not happy to see Karnan. In order for him to live well, he must avoid things that can irritate him. If it was in the past, Dorothea must have tried to look better than Ray, and also been punished many times by Karnan. He reflected on how stupid he was, because he entertained himself with useless illusions, and he himself is annoyed. But now he realized that for the sake of living well, he would do nothing more. Once he tries, surely what will arise is only anger and hatred. Dorothea was reading a book in the garden, and he was contemplating his thoughts, and thought about all the things the wet nurse beside him was doing. He tried to give it welfare, and as soon as he decides to do something, he will only cause her anger and discontent, so that he was pulled out of his mind, when a voice called him, and asked questions about his whereabouts. He heard Ray's voice asking where Dorothea was. When he heard that, his mood immediately deteriorated. Servant asks Prince what brought him here. He asked if Dorothea was here. The princess immediately ran away with a request that the nurse say she was not there. The maid hesitated what to say to him, and then he himself wondered where he was. Ray said that he wanted to show the princess how to handle the spirit of light. Dorothea, who was hiding behind the pillar, didn't understand why she had to see him controlling the spirit of light. Did he decide to laugh it off, which had made him angry? The spirit of light is called a blessing that is only available to the millionaire family. But this is just an old story. We see how Ray demonstrates in front of the nurses how he can control the petals in the air and point them in different directions. Millionaire's power that can publish the sun is getting weaker, and currently only able to light a small fire. Until one day, Millionaire was born who couldn't control spirits at all. Like Dorothea, she was born into the millionaire family, the princess who was unable to summon any spirits. Dorothea Millionaire. He was removed completely from that tradition. Then Karnan also had more and more reasons not to love her. Therefore he challenged the Almighty, and hated Ray even more. How great is the spirit of light? It's just a little firefly in a very cryptic tale of the past, and used as a basis for maintaining power. Thus he used his sword to seize the spirit's power. He ascended his own throne by ending the fairy tale era, and glorified the era of humans with blood-stained swords. But in the end, he failed. Just a few years ago, he was already executed along with his title of tyrant. It was possible that spirits could indeed determine one's ability to become emperor. At the end of his sad life, this great legend punished his proud self. Although now it doesn't matter anymore. Now he sat and thought as this little bastard who talked to the wet nurse when was he going to leave. He asked again if he didn't know exactly where Dorothea was, and the nurse regretfully said that she didn't know, not sure the prince is sad, because a friend came to him and he wanted to introduce them. Dorothea, who heard all this, assumed that maybe her friend, who must be a child of Ray's age, who was also annoying. He decides to leave Ray to wet the nurse, and he'd better take a nap. He left thinking that if he turned here, it would be difficult to get to his room without Ray knowing. The main thing is not to get caught. He turned inside and met another boy with dark hair. Dorothea fell from the crash. She dropped her book. The boy immediately apologized and asked if he was badly hurt. She looked up and instantly blushed. He thought and did not understand what he was doing here, because there was no way the man she loved more than anyone in this world, in a previous life, the man who hated her the most. How could she be able to forget him? Then we see a picture in which he looks at the hanging body of his lover. She cried and rushed to him. It was true, how could he forget her, because she was his love, his breath, and his eternity. Back to reality, the boy asked Dorothea if she was okay. He held out his hand to her and asked if she could get up. Since the day of his return, he had not forgotten her for a second. She wakes up hot with tears in her eyes and calls him by the name Theon. The boy looks at her in surprise and says he is really sorry. Did it really hurt him? Dorothea was sitting with her face in her hands. She looked at the dress and said it had gotten very dirty. He said it was his fault for not paying enough attention. He held out a handkerchief and apologized. He began to take at least he was worried, and asked again if his leg was sprained. Would he be able to walk, or would it be better for him to call someone? He said emotionally that he really wanted to meet her, and say his name. Dorothea said she missed Theon a lot, so that the boy thought that it turns out that he heard everything correctly. Did he really know her? She didn't understand. She kept crying. Tears flowed like a river. He wiped everything with this handkerchief. He reflects that there are other things that are much more important now. He asks her not to cry, otherwise his eyes will swell. He wiped the tears from Dorothea's face with his fingers. Dorothea's heart pounded. Because the person who turned and left him is now beside him, very beautifully, and he is still alive. And this is not a dream. He started to cry even more. Maybe just because he is alive means he has done his duty in this life. She smiled and told him he was someone smart, which might be the cause of his rebirth. Ray will come for Dorothea. She asks if he really hurt himself. If all is well, he's very worried. He immediately ran towards her, still with questions about what happened. She saw bruises on her knees, and her dress was dirty and wrinkled. She is still seen with tears in her eyes. He replied that nothing bad had happened. He didn't need to worry about it. Ray pounced on Theon. He grabbed her by the shoulders and asked if Dorothea was crying because of him. Theon sadly replies that it's probably because of him. He lowered his gaze and head and kept saying that it seemed like it was, and apologizing. Ray gets angry and calls Theon a real bastard. She screamed at him that she thought they could be good friends, and that Dorothea had never cried like that since she was a baby. Before he asked what he did to Dorothea, Theon is trying to justify himself to His Highness Raymond. Then Dorothea intervened and asked Ray to stop because he wasn't crying because of Theon. He lied that he just got something in his eye. He said that his eyes were covered with thorns, so that his eyes hurt. Raymond also believed. He nervously asked if everything was okay, so now he replied that everything was fine. And at the same time, Dorothea thought that she had not expected that day to come, when he would think gratefully how stupid Ray was. Ray was worried and finally calmed down how relieved he was. He asks what happened to his knee wound. Then he replied that it was just a small wound and it would heal in a moment. Theon in between realizes that it is a princess, and that she also covered up her mistakes in front of her brother. But he didn't get to meet the princess before he wondered what kind of expression was on her face. When he first saw her, Ray turned to Theon, and he sincerely apologized for misunderstanding everything. Theon smiled and said it was nothing, because he really is to blame. Ray took her by the shoulders and they stood in front of Dorothea. The prince said happily that he would display it properly, because he has a chance. He introduced his new friend in front of Dorothea, and Theon says he was rude the first time they met. Dorothea realizes that she will be introduced to Theon. He introduced Theon to him, then Theon kissed his hand. Dorothea blushed and thought that this was their new start. There is no history between them. If he forgot his mad pursuit of love, put away the suffering from the past and loved more for himself, would he treat Dorothea better in this life? She wanted to say something to him happily, but then the mood changed. Dorothea heard someone's voice calling out to Theon. He heard that someone say that he wanted to go together with Theon, so why did he go alone? Dorothea knew this voice. He turned around and recognized the girl as Theon's first and last love. In front of them was a girl with long, soft pink hair and a red sundress. The girl's name was Julia Delavigne. In his past life, Theon, who was forced to marry him, married him because of his insistence and also a family agreement. He only loved Julia until the end of his life. They have been friends since childhood and have shared their affection for a long time. They matched perfectly like a pair of puzzle pieces that had no gaps for Dorothea to fit into. That's how his life used to be. He's the one who keeps chasing after Karnan's affection but can't get it. She's the one who keeps chasing Theon's love but can't get it too. Live without love. Even after marrying him, Theon is still looking for Julia. He exchanged dozens of letters with Julia without her knowledge. Her radiant face at that time, she never showed him. Dorothea wished Julia would disappear from Theon. He wished Julia would just die. When his trusted men stage a fake crime and bring news of Julia's death, he is elated. Dorothea had thought Theon would finally come to her, but he would prefer death to be free from it, and left with Julia. His ambition was the cause of his death. His selfish love had killed him. Can it still be called love? Even now it feels like his heart is still being torn apart. The boy turned to Julia. Ray informs that Julia has come to wait for him. Julia replied that she was very bored. Ray introduces Julia Delavigne to Dorothea and says she has come with Theon from Freedy territory. Julia greets daughter Dorothea. He only answered a brief hello. He kept thinking that these two were together even in this life. He wondered what kind of expression he had on his face right now. He must have been filled with this feeling, so it looks unpleasant. He said he remembered that he had something to do, so he will go to the room. Ray asked Dorothea if she would play with them, but he just walked away without answering. Ray doesn't understand what's wrong with him. Suddenly, Theon and Julia also looked at each other in disbelief. He goes to his room. Dorothea thought that the crown prince had died at her hands, his love that prefers death to avoid it, and the woman who was loved by his love who died because of false accusations. Among them, there is no place for him. She hurriedly went to her room with tears in her eyes from her horrible self-confession. Waitress asks if she wants to play with her friends. Dorothea lay in a dark and empty room. She replied that she didn't want to because she was tired. The maid complied and said there was nothing that could be done, and let her rest, and she would wake Dorothea before dinner. The maid leaves. Dorothea lay holding a handkerchief with Theon's name in her hand, with his name embroidered on the edge of the fabric. She hugged this handkerchief tightly to herself and wept bitterly. On a sunny day. Outside, the sun was shining brightly. There are no clouds in the sky. In the palace, Dorothea was sitting reading a book, and seen behind him there is someone who is walking back and forth, and he walked quickly and with a loud voice. An annoyed Dorothea closed the book and asked Ray if he couldn't just sit still. He replied that he was very worried, because today he would officially become the crown prince. He says right, he will become the crown prince of Ubera. This is a very important role. He said that this made him even scarier. He turned to Dorothea and asked if he looked like the crown prince. Dorothea looked at Ray and saw in him only a cute, whimpering puppy. With all his looks, he replied that no, he looked like a fool today too. He was sad and asked if this was true. Dorothea asked him to do something with her face first. He asks how to do it with his face. He squeezed his cheek with his palm and asked if it was necessary. According to Dorothea, that this desperate fool should run the empire. He has many worries. Ray said that it would be nice if he didn't become the heir, but him. Dorothea. She tensed and gripped the book. He kept arguing that surely he wouldn't tremble, but proudly passed the ceremony because he was smarter than her, more talented than him. She was sure she would make an excellent empress. Dorothea simply replied that she didn't know how to summon spirits, so he can't. Ray, who smiled and actively said he knew. He would also soon be able to summon spirits. Who, if not the clever Dorothea to call them? This carefree simplicity was like poison to Dorothea. He thought that he was behaving like this only because he was ignorant, and will gradually understand everything over time. He would understand the full weight of carelessly thrown words. Ray asked him if he could wish him good luck. As soon as he answered with a question, why did he do that? He begged her because if his Dorothea wished him luck, he was sure he would. Dorothea simply replied happily that she had just failed. He was annoyed. He said that Dorothea was so cold, she asked to hug her sister once. Dorothea just nonchalantly tried to leave to hide somewhere from him. He just ignored all her requests and pleas. A maid informs that Ray has to come in soon, which worries him even more. The crown handover ceremony was the event when the next emperor's successor was mentioned. It could be considered as one of the major events in the empire. But if he thought about it, that he had not noticed before. But now everything seemed so simple to him. He looked around and concluded in his head that Karnan was not as vain as he seemed. But he still had doubts. Maybe he's just a spender. He began to remember something that was in childhood. It must be here that they announced that His Imperial Highness was entering the hall. Even this event seemed extravagant to Dorothea. The emperor begins his monologue by saying that the whole empire will be illuminated by the light of the noble millionaire's goodness. Now Dorothea has stopped experiencing any emotions, which he looked at the scenery and thought that there must be a spiritual stone missing in this staff. He thought and reflected that the stone fragment was found right before the execution. He heard something similar, but can't remember what exactly happened. The monologue that continues in the background, the princess continues thinking that it doesn't matter and has nothing to do with her now. After all, they announce that now they will continue the ceremony. The door opened with little Prince Ray entering, smiling and a confident look, and Dorothea hoped that she would not make a mistake. Ray caught her eye and immediately broke into a big smile. Dorothea raised her index finger in a refusal sign. He thinks why she is making such stupid face. He was trying to tell her to look ahead and walk properly. He looked and just nodded his head. Dorothea was even more clueless as to why he was nodding his head. Is he really that stupid? Suddenly all the spirits gathered at him. He tries to explain to Rei that he usually controls spirits. He believed that now such a fool became the crown prince. He wouldn't make a mistake like that. A large crown is worn on Rei's appearance, and Dorothea came to the conclusion that she had no right to such thoughts. But at least it would be better if the real hero became the wise emperor this time. The ceremony continues. Many guests congratulated the crown prince on the event. The emperor walked in front with the crown prince, and Dorothea walked alone behind. All that was said to them was a sign of congratulations. The princess did not hear. He reflected to himself that for him, the last name millionaire was like a curse. The lady distracted her and looked at Dorothea and said that with time she looked more and more like the late empress. Others agreed and said that he really is a complete copy of himself and his youth. The fact that Dorothea always had to fight such situations, and also the emperor answered that woman they were talking nonsense. They only apologized for their words and their rudeness. And the fact that he couldn't leave this place. Even when he was openly rejected by Karnan, and Rei was at the center of any conversation and was treated no better than a candle hanging on the wall. But he couldn't go anywhere, because he's a millionaire. Before rebirth, he would stand in the center and start to boast about his merits, while humiliating Rei, the stupid crown prince, thus emphasizing how stupid Rei was. Rei turned to him and told him to go to them. Dorothea kept thinking that there wasn't a single thought like that in her head at the moment. He didn't understand what was so funny about all of this. He just wanted this time to end. He kept calling Rei stupid, and this was his place. She could claim him even if he called her problem wouldn't be solved, and because she should just be standing here. It would be better to prepare a place for him to sit. Theon comes up to him and says he's bored. That's right, he turned around and immediately recognizing the voice, he saw Theon dressed beautifully in front of him with a red bow around his neck and a glass in his hand. Theon approached Dorothea with questions because he was bored. Once Dorothea wondered why he was here. Thought he would be with Julia. He held out a glass with a drink and asked her to drink it, because he saw that he had not drank anything for a long time. Kaylee, he smiled, broadly reached out his hand for the glass and thanked Theon. He thought in his head that this was Theon's pomegranate juice. He even felt it was a pity to drink it. Theon said that he was very proud of His Highness Prince Raymond. He takes great pride in his open-mindedness. He asked again about Rei, who answered in the affirmative that yes, that he said that Dorothea studied all the real lore of the Empire. Dorothea said he was not a great person. He says it looks like they will be able to meet at the episteme soon. He held the glass in his hand and thought about the words episteme. It was the best academy in the Empire where only the most outstanding talents were trained, as well as the main place where the descendants of noble families studied together gained connections for the future. There were people not only from Ubera, but also from neighboring lands descended from noble families who came to the episteme. But it's not like Rei who can easily enter this academy. Dorothea, due to the fact that she could not outshine the crown prince, could not enter the episteme. One day he tried to fight this going outside the palace and throwing a stone at the episteme. But this rock broke the window and hit Duke Bronte's eldest son on the head, and after that Karnan locked Dorothea in the palace, then ended their relationship with Karnan. He thought that there was no need to repeat this twice. He had long since abandoned any claim. He tells Theon out loud that he's not going to the episteme. He asked how much because she was a princess. He began to say that he was sure of something for sure, but he expected to see the Emperor with Rei. Dorothea noticed this, and thought that Theon was smart enough that he knew how to keep his mouth shut when he needs to, and that he understands exactly what the situation is here. He was sad because he didn't want to show himself to Theon the way he had decided to. To shift the subject to another topic, he smiled and started to say that, come to think of the weather today, he didn't finish because Julia shouted that Theon was summoned by Julia's Archduke, and he smiled brightly and waved at them. Theon apologizes to the princess, saying that it looks like it's time for him to go. He replied that there was nothing to do in his head. He thought Julia had come to get Theon. Theon said goodbye, and said that they would meet later. He was left alone again among the many people he thought he needed to go to the room too. Amidst the hubbub and noise, he approached the emperor saying he had something to say, but suddenly a man accidentally pushed her and spilled pomegranate juice on her dress. As a result, the spilled juice stained the entire front of his clothes. The first thing Dorothea thought about that was Theon giving her some pomegranate juice. The man panicked and didn't know what to do. The emperor looked and asked what was going on here. The man apologizes and says it is his mistake. The emperor ordered Dorothea to apologize to the man. She didn't understand why the emperor urged her to say it quickly. Everyone in the hall fell silent in anticipation. Rei intervened, speaking to the emperor, saying it was Dorothea who was suffering here. In front of him, looking down, Duke Bronte was clueless and worried because he understood very well that he was clearly to blame here. Dorothea said in her mind that she must apologize to Duke Bronte because she was a much more important guest than her own daughter. Duke said it was okay because it was his fault. He kept thinking and wondering what was so hard about some kind of apology, because Karnan had been behaving like this for more than a day or two. The Duke asked Dorothea to raise her head. She kept thinking that if she remembered everything and got angry, it will only make it worse. So he just needed to take it for granted. The emperor ordered Robert's servant to escort Dorothea because her clothes were dirty. She listened and bowed before him. The princess thought it was a good thing because she had a reason to go, and that was enough. She left with the maid, but decided to accidentally turn around. He saw Theon and Julia standing up in complete shock. They show that they are worried. She asked herself if she had seen an awkward princess who had lost the last bit of her authority. He wanted her not to look at him, not to see him like that. A glass of pomegranate juice full of red love spilled again and became a feeling that littered it. He sat alone in his room again. He hugged himself and knelt to endure such feelings. No attitude towards him, and apologizing and putting aside the dignity that is tolerable for him. But one look from Theon made him feel like he was being turned upside down. How cute it was, because he knew that Theon would never love him. He understood what had to be let go. Anyway, it seemed like everything inside was on fire when he saw them together with Julia. He decided that he had to let Theon go as soon as possible. Someone knocked and asked if he was okay. Rei stands outside the door and says he came because he was worried. He didn't ask her to come to him. Dorothea was angry and screamed at him to leave her alone and go back to her place. Rei insists that he is not leaving because he is here. In the room, he made it clear that he was not interested in the coronation ball, so let them play together. At these words, Dorothea flew into a rage, leaving the room, and ordered her to open her ears and listen carefully. Rei was scared of her. She screamed at her that she couldn't go from there just because she wasn't interested in the party. Since he is the crown prince, act like the crown prince. Don't think about continuing to play and do the real work. Dorothea added that she didn't need his worries. He begs to leave her alone. An emotional Dorothea grabbed Rei's collar, while Rei didn't know what to say. He continues that if he does not understand. Suddenly, Theon and Julia come up to them and see him holding Rei by the collar. Theon, who was shocked, came forward to the two of them and then asked if he was okay. Dorothea just looked at Theon in silence and confusion. He looked terrified. Dorothea just stared at him in silence. Rei said he brought Theon and Julia to play together. He released Rei and walked into the room, then slammed the door. Dorothea just stood in the door at first, and then she fell to her knees. He remembered the frightened expressions on Theon's and Julia's shocked faces. He wondered to himself, starting from where the error lies. Dorothea felt that now she looked pathetic and unloved. Now what did they think of him? Dorothea hated herself. He was determined he must live well more than anyone. That was the way to atone for his sins. After that incident, he couldn't get out of bed for several days. He had a fever, and his body ached. Meanwhile, the nurses who took care of her kept calling her their unhappy little princess. Dan said that he should get well as soon as possible, even though it was painful, but he had to endure. He opens his eyes, repeating the line that he has to be better than anyone. He didn't finish and fell asleep again. Now that was all he could do. So several days passed, where Rei does not come to him. He was in his room, on his bed reading another book. She thought she hated him now that he screamed at her like that back then. She thought he was bothering her, so she was even happy. But his mind was distracted. He saw someone out of the corner of his eye. He saw Ray hiding from behind the wall. Dorothea asked Ray what he was doing. He was frightened by the question that came out of her mouth and said that she brought him a present. Dorothea said there was no need. Ray said that he would definitely like this gift. He opened the basket and said that these were the first tomatoes he had grown. It turned out that he had secretly planted a garden behind the palace. Dorothea clearly did not expect such a gift, and it was obvious he wasn't happy about that. Ray nervously asked if they had pretty colors. Ray added that he grew pumpkins and eggplants too. If it is fruitful, then he will give it to Dorothea. While Dorothea sighed, he thought that the crown prince who entered the Episteme Academy was wasting his time gardening. Then Dorothea asked Ray, so she assumed maybe Ray didn't study and grow vegetables in the garden. Ray was shocked and said that he was also studying. Dorothea sighed heavily and thought that someone tried their best to win against her. And unlike Dorothea, she got everything easy. He just played his all-time favorite game and replaced the rightful crown prince. Ray was worried and said that he really studied hard. He asks her if she is mad and apologizes. He muttered that he refused last time, and he begged her to play with him. He clasped his hands into his palms, waiting for a response. Dorothea relented and called out to him. He listened to her intently. Dorothea finally said that in this way, he would not be able to become a good emperor. After all, Dorothea decided to live better than anyone this time. Ray scratched his head and agreed, saying it was true. Dorothea still thought that somehow wanting to not let him become emperor was just because he couldn't escape the fate of a tyrant. Ray asked him to try tomatoes. They might taste good. The tomatoes looked fresh. And as soon as he takes it, and of course in Episteme, he will try his best and will be a great big brother. He smiled at her happily. Dorothea turned away from him and thought that it would be better if this fool did his job better. She muttered again with hope and asked if he didn't want to come out. Sometimes he said that he thought it was stuffy for him to sit in the palace all the time. Dorothea thought that after all, if she thought about it, she had never been out of the palace until now, because he didn't even study in Episteme. But in his previous life he was very bored, so that now he is not even curious. But he already knew all this. Ray had said loudly and confidently that he had never been outside the palace, and it was stuffy sitting inside the whole time. Last time they stopped at the market, and there was a lot of goods from different parts of the continent. Dorothea was silent. He kept saying that if he went outside, he was sure that he would like it too. And he'll feel like he knows so much because he's so smart, so maybe they'll go out with him. Here Dorothea interrupts. She says she doesn't want to leave the palace. Ray, almost with tears in his eyes, asked why he wouldn't. She said she just didn't want to. After that, Ray always followed Dorothea around with offers to go out together. He simply replied that he didn't want to. And Ray is not going to give up. He's been begging and begging Dorothea. He thought that he would settle down if he refused. However, when he opened the book, he found a note asking him to leave together. And Ray's happy face immediately appeared. Dorothea decided she couldn't take it anymore and finally agreed. Ray was of course delighted, but here Dorothea made a condition that she would go alone. He can go with a nurse or a chaperone, but he wasn't going to go with Ray. Ray was sad, but he agreed anyway because Dorothea agreed to go outside. Then the nurse told the princess how beautiful it was. Did Dorothea apologize and ask if she should go out dressed like that? She replied that of course because it suited her so well. Dorothea was wearing a long pale blue and purple dress with flowers and floral ornaments tucked into her loosely tied hair. Dorothea said that she was very uncomfortable. The nurse said that she really wanted to put these clothes on her, and finally the day had come when she would be able to see the shine of the clothes when she walked by. The nurse concluded that she was so happy. He took Dorothea's hand and told them to leave quickly before he changed his mind. Dorothea already regretted that she decided to go out. They find themselves in a market full of people. As soon as the thought crossed Dorothea's mind that there were a lot of people here, the maid confirmed her thoughts with a question since there were a lot of people here. The nurse suggested holding her hand tightly so she wouldn't get lost, and held out her hand to Dorothea. The princess at first thought that she was not a child. Although not now, she is of course still a child. He held the nurse's hand. In his previous life, he had never walked hand in hand with anyone. Here he is turning his face away from the nurse as he is embarrassed. Nurse asks to see her coming in and asks what is she seeing for the first time from here. He saw an endlessly glistening sky with a sea that was all bright blue and green. He looks at all areas of how people work and talk, how people walk near the fountain. He remembers in his past life when there was a war. The weary city and the streets of people that looked more like corpses in his memory was a wind soaked with the smell of blood. He looked at the entire cityscape now and concluded that this was what an empire without a tyrant would be like. The nurse drew Dorothy's attention to the square where musicians were giving a performance and suggested taking a look at it once. Dorothea wondered if she could enjoy this world a little. He squeezed the nurse's hand tighter, and they walked towards the field. From the corner, a suspicious man is seen grinning. 9-year-old daughter Dorothea. He lay tied up on the dirty floor. His eyes were also tied. He couldn't see anything. There is a conversation going on in the background. Turns out he was kidnapped for ransom. 2 crooks are sitting at the table and eating chicken with appetite. And the 2 are discussing that some girls wear clothes that are more expensive than their entire house is worth, which makes them mad. Dorothea thought that after rebirth she had never practiced the sword. He didn't expect that such a thing would happen. Previously, 4 days ago, when he was walking with his nanny in town. The nurse enthusiastically asked how a princess could be so cute. Dorothea looked at herself in the mirror. He was wearing a wizard's hat. The nurse admired every picture and offered to buy them all. Which Dorothea asked to wait, but the nurse dragged her elsewhere because it was fun there. Dorothea wished she hadn't gone out again. They walk quietly. On the way, the nurse offers to buy his favorite book before returning to the palace. Since they were out, he said if he went down that alley, they would see a bookstore. From such a proposal, Dorothea already had a desire to buy a book. The nurse also suggested after going to the bookstore to go have a delicious dessert. And it's such a short way that nobody's here at all. The wet nurse kept saying she wanted to see Dorothea happy. But they were followed by a man with a stick and hit the nurse on the head with it, so he fell unconscious to the ground. Dorothea tried to understand what was happening and wanted to help the nurse, but a handkerchief filled with poison had already been brought up to her nose and mouth. He slowly lost consciousness, and the last thing he heard was an offer to go out for dessert with the nurse. That's the story, and now she's lying like this in some kind of kidnapper's basement. It is hard to imagine a more sad sight. He thought it would be fine even if he died early, but still he didn't want to die at the hands of such a villain. They would need time to prepare everything and send it to the Red Well. Dorothea heard this with such shock that she was unconscious for 4 whole days. He thinks why he has no strength and is very thirsty. He thought that because they had let go of the wet nurse to bring them money, but there was no news yet. And what will happen next will surely be his death. He assumed that it was possible that Karnan would not want to save him. He thought that instead of wasting money, it would be better to throw away this useless self. Dorothea could not hope for Karnan. Dorothea made a sound and both turned to her, assuming she was awake. He said out loud that he could see nothing. This method is out of style. He ordered them to let him go. A man approaches him. She thought that first she needed to pretend to be a weak little girl. Man untied his eyes. He innocently greeted him and politely asked the uncle who he was. He smiled, calling her a cute little girl. He introduces himself as Uncle Tutu. He thought that the 2 of them were kidnappers, but they looked like some market bandits who had rolled out of nowhere. He asked sweetly again if she was really going to be his new nanny. Now she replies that no, of course she's not a nanny. Dorothea made an innocent face and asked if he was really Dad's friend. And in his head he was just angry that Dorothea Millionaire's daughter was forced to behave like that. The man laughs and says it is true. He's a friend of his father. Dorothea asked if she could then call him Uncle Tutu, to which she happily agreed and allowed. And in Dorothea's mind, she thought she was going to kill them. She was told that she was as beautiful as a doll because she was a child of royalty. He recalled the old days of saying that she was beautiful, where someone said that he was ready to do anything just to make her smile at him. The lips of the man who kissed her hand and asked her to smile. At least once there used to be one person who repeated the same thing to him over and over again. He concluded that of course he didn't like the way he looked. But he didn't seem so terrible to other people. He pretended to look around and asked where they were. He replied that they were at their uncle's house. He looked at her face and asked about the scar above her eyebrow. What is it, and is it cool? Tutu decided to tell the whole story. He said that before Uncle fought with terrible villains 17 against 1. But the only usable weapons were his own fists. But one of these cowards took a knife from under his clothes and struck him in the heart. But he was able to dodge. Then he finally said that this was nothing, because after that, Uncle Tutu drove the enemy to the forest where he met a bear. Dorothea, who was sitting next to her, just tried to listen carefully and clapped her hands in admiration, while inside he thought that he could write a better book. But thanks to this, Dorothea had time to check. He pondered and came to the conclusion that first the situation was unfavorable. His stomach is growling. He tugged at the hem of his uncle's shirt and said in a tone that he wanted to eat. He called out that their little mistress was hungry and turned to Danny and told him she was hungry. He just replied nonchalantly with a question, and so what was said. They had lunchtime, and the girl had not eaten for a long time. He sighed and said fine to her, as if they were holding a children's camp here. Dorothea saw delicious sausages, scrambled eggs, bread, and a whole chicken with lettuce. He thought they were enjoying a delicious meal and dreamed of the money they would get thanks to his kidnapping. He felt disgusting, of course, but he hadn't experienced such a strong hunger for a long time. Tutu picked him up and put him on the table. Like any child, he asked her where she was sitting and let her go. She told Tutu to calm down. Did he decide to play with it? He tried to justify himself, and Dorothea made pleading and pitying eyes on him. By this time, Dorothea was not feeling well and asked herself if it was because she had not eaten for 4 days. That's why he felt that way. He ordered the tutu to tie him to the pole, but he refused. Then one of them put a knife to Dorothea's throat and said he wasn't her uncle, but a kidnapper. He explained that his reason for kidnapping Dorothea was because he couldn't stand the sight of a rich kid like him. He was hit by pushing him against the wall with his back touching the wall. Seeing that, Tutu said that Danny was too outrageous. But Danny interrupts him and says later he will kill him, so what's too much? Or did the little girl want to die first? Dorothea was left alone. But suddenly Danny screamed in fear. Tutu also did not understand what happened. Danny said that there was something under the table with eyes twinkling in the darkness. Dorothea wondered what had frightened them so much, even though it was just a scorpion. He thought that there were no scorpions in the capital in that case. Meanwhile, Tutu and Danny get scared and pass the responsibility of killing the scorpion to each other. Dorothea thought she was hungry here, and they were screaming here. He suggested to the kidnappers that if he caught the scorpion, would they give him his bread and milk. They couldn't believe it, and asked again if he would catch the scorpion. Dorothea replied that she only needed 2 sticks. They agree, but only if he catches the scorpion. Danny's command and Tutu let go. He removed it with the cover, then gave her the chopsticks. He thought that he had seen a stick. He didn't understand why the scorpion scared them so much. He holds the scorpion's tail with this stick and informs that he finally caught it. Both of them told him to throw it away or kill him. Dorothea said that she did not know how to kill. He was so hungry that he had no strength in his hands. Danny tells him to throw it away, and once he throws it, they will give him the food. He held out the scorpion to them, and he asked them to be able to give them food tomorrow and the day after. They just quickly agreed. He went with this scorpion, down the long stairs. He understood why it was dark the whole time, because they were underground. He went out and saw the desert. He now understood why their guard was so lax. It was because there were no directions at all in that vast wasteland. Dorothea wondered where the village was located. Does anyone know where he is? If this was the case, then he couldn't just run away without a plan. How can he find hope there? While the two were discussing something enthusiastically, Dorothea was eating bread. He thought that they still kept their promise, and Dorothea hoped another scorpion would appear. Tutu shouts to Danny that the princess has disappeared in the capital. Then Dorothea saw the two of them and said that someone had kidnapped her. Danny understood something and told Tutu to follow him. Dorothea secretly wondered who it was, but it was best to keep things a secret. If only for the welfare of the imperial court. If the two wanted to stick around, then they wouldn't give it to the palace. He got up from the table and thought that waiting for Karnan was a crazy idea. Then he found a knife, and decided that this would be enough. He overhears a conversation where they are discussing some future plans. They debated whether to take his life since he was still a child. But at the same time, she is a princess. If he survives, he will betray them. And they will. The two end up in a cemetery. They decided that one would go get 2 camels, and the others will deal with the girl. At this moment, Dorothea realized that her fate was sealed. He saw his reflection on the blade of the knife, so he had no choice but to take the knife. Danny suddenly opens the door and says they are really in trouble, but he saw that the room was empty. He hides behind the door. When he looks for it, then she decided to attack him with the knife. She realized that there was little chance. There is only one way to win, because he was at a disadvantage. He swung and only scratched his back with the knife. He turned to her. He didn't finish his thought because Danny grabbed him by the neck, but Dorothea wanted to stab her hand with a knife. But Danny let go of the knife from his hand and held it tight. The knife just fell to the floor. Dorothea has no strength, so she can't attack. If he was a little stronger. Danny screamed, and that he just wanted to let her die in peace. He tells her not to Mlawana, because no matter how much he tries, he couldn't do anything. From these words, Dorothea calmed down and thought about the phrase. Was there really nothing she could do? He was getting angry. His teeth were chattering from these thoughts that no matter how much he tried, he couldn't beat Ray and couldn't get into episteme. He kicked Danny in the stomach, so he leaned back. He continues to emotionally reflect on all the failures, that he has not been able to attract Karnan's attention. She remembers Theon, and concludes that she doesn't love him either. He took the knife in his hand, and again he remembered that in the future the subject he trusted would also have to kill him. He stabbed Danny with a knife. All he could hear was his screams of pain. He lay curled up and held the leg that was pierced by the knife. Danny begs him not to kill him. Dorothea saw those eyes again, the gaze he had often seen before his rebirth. He seemed to see a monster. He wonders why. He just wants to live. He finally spoke out loud and asked that she be left alone and that she promised to be a good girl. He turned around and thought again why everyone couldn't just leave him alone. Now he just wants everyone to let him live to die. He went to the desert. He coughed from the wind and realized that the sun had already set, and it was getting dark. He was cold because there was no light in this desert. This helplessness frightened him. He thought that if he could control the spirit of light, it would be better for him than now. But then he thought that not if Ray was where he is now. Everyone would have come to save him. He knelt down and realized that even now he was thinking about it. He thought himself ridiculous. He fell with his whole body on the sand and lost consciousness. The dark night is full of bright stars and fluffy clouds. He moved his index finger. He opened his eyes slightly and vaguely saw a bottomless desert and dark sky. He realized he had lost consciousness, wondering how much time had passed, and concluded that he would die here. He thought that to die alone. He saw stars. It is somehow too much for him. He saw a light on the horizon. He saw this light, heard a voice approaching him. There was someone kneeling and calling for the princess. Dorothea thought she was finally dying, but he gave her the will to live again. He raised his hand and said softly that he was here. He had killed so many people in the past, but he still wanted to live. He thought maybe Karnan had sent them, but he also assumed that it could be the bandits again. He passed out on the sand again. People have always turned their backs on him, but only such thoughts appeared in his head. It was funny to him, of course, but he was always like that. There are maids approaching her and trying to do something. Dorothea still thought she wanted to believe that someone would love her one day. He wanted to believe that at least someone would love him. Dorothea slowly opened her eyes. He saw everything dimly at first, and then it all became clearer. He saw a ceiling with a flashing chandelier. Often he looked around in his room. The curtains looked familiar. Bedside tables, cupboards with patterned plates. He understood that he had come back here again. She remembers someone calling her a princess in the desert. So he thought, if it was the palace soldiers who found him, was it luck amidst misfortune? Then Dorothea woke up with a start. He wakes up from his sleep. He heard Karnan's voice. Yang said that the one who had kidnapped him was an unknown kidnapper. He lifted himself up and straightened his back. There the nurse makes excuses that they are some nameless kidnappers. Karnan says, that means he was kidnapped by such a worthless bandit. All Dorothea thought she had come here because she was almost kidnapped. He thought he was his real father after all. But it turned out that he was bothering her instead. Let there be no more excitement. Dorothea heard Karnan's order. Karnan ordered his maid to find the person who leaked about it out and take care of it. Then he would subject anyone who spread these rumors to severe punishment. Then Dorothea thought that in the past, she thought Karnan hated her because she was ambitious. But even without fighting or taking Ray's property, Karnan still doesn't like him. Perhaps that was the punishment for his past cruelty. The sins of the previous life must be redeemed. Dorothea thought she should think that way, because if he didn't, he wouldn't be able to survive. He lay down the other way and covered himself with the blanket, and continued to ponder sadly. That's right. He believed that things were exactly like that. Otherwise it would be unbearable for him to endure all this in the palace. The next day, the doctor reported that the princess's fever had just gone down, and was now a bit feverish again. He said the healing process was too slow. Another waitress asked if she was okay. Dorothea thought she was seeing this babysitter for the first time. He began to say out loud that he was fine. Then Dorothea thought and compared her old nurse. Was the nurse fired? Even though it's not his fault. He is a person who is always kind and takes care of her. She was worried about him. Dorothea wished him well. Then the doctor said that it seemed better for the princess to recuperate in a quiet place to rest. The nurse said that it was still better for the princess to live in the castle, but she said again that there were good places. There is a fine imperial villa for recuperation in the Cerithian region. Somehow, hearing those words, he realized that, in other words, this was an opportunity for him to leave the palace and get away from Karnan, Ray, and Theon with Julia, who was about to go to the episteme, and also where no one will see him to train and get strong, so he doesn't suffer anymore. Because he had always been afraid. He will return to being a tyrant. So he avoided this possibility. However, if he uses his powers in the right way, maybe he can protect someone. He told the servants out loud that he was going on vacation, to live well, because he needs strength. Nanny asks how is it possible to go there alone. Dorothea replied that it was too stuffy for her here. The waiter said that he never behaved like this, so why is he being stubborn like that? Ray came up to her with flowers and asked how she was doing. Dorothea was sick of him having come every day since the day of the kidnapping. Ray asks what they were talking about. The nanny replied that they were discussing the possibility of the princess going on vacation to recuperate. Ray didn't understand what kind of break they were talking about, and the servant replied that he would go to the imperial villa in the Cerithian region. The air is cool, and it is located on the beach. The princess's mood will definitely improve as well. But Ray looked worried. Even now Dorothea's conditions seemed to be getting better, but why did she still need to go there? Dorothea said if she wanted to go there, then told Ray to get out. Then he said if somehow he felt guilty. But the kidnapping wasn't his fault, so he didn't need to keep coming to her. Then Ray said that if it wasn't for her constantly nagging him to go outside the palace, that incident definitely wouldn't have happened. Dorothea looked at him and said it didn't matter anymore because it was all in the past. Ray climbed over her with a hug and asked if she really needed to go to another royal villa. Here he asks what the problem is. He replied that then he would be there alone. Then Ray thought that instead of Dorothea going there alone, it would be better if she just went into the episteme. Ray promised to help her so he would be with her. Then Dorothea said she couldn't go there. Ray even said that if Dorothea was smart then she could do it, and don't give up too quickly. But there is one thing Ray doesn't know, that he had tried hard to study in order to get there, but Karnan forbade him to go there. Never mind, how do you understand this stupid kid like Ray? Then Dorothea said that she had decided to recuperate, so he ended the conversation unilaterally. He said he was tired and asked Ray to leave. After Ray left, the nanny said that Raymond was acting as if he was worried about her. Dorothea knew that. He knows he's bad. It's always been like that. Thus this uninvited guest had to leave immediately. A few days later, Dorothea left. She wore only a light dress for her trip. He wore a hat on his head with a yellow ribbon around his neck. He thought that at such moments he was thanking Karnan for his indifference. He couldn't imagine that he would leave so soon. He remembers Ray crying and begging him not to go. Seeing Theon, he told him with a smile that she heard he was going on vacation. He looked at her at first rejoicing, and then thought that she didn't want to see him at all now. He sadly lowered his eyes to the ground, responding that yes, he was going to Cerithian territory. Then he asked why. He suddenly asked, she replied that honestly he came because he wanted to give her something. He said that he was relieved it wasn't too late. He reached into his pocket with his hand. Dorothea asked her question if it was really a gift for her. He said of course nothing special. He took out of his pocket 3 candies of different colors, red, yellow, and blue. He said he brought it because he was worried he would get seasick. Dorothea stared at him silently without holding out her hand. Theon awkwardly asks, maybe he doesn't like candy at all. He couldn't believe in his head if it really was for him. He answered loudly that he didn't like it. He takes the candy from her hand and thanks her for the concern. Theon blushed and sadly requested that now they would not be able to see each other, because he suddenly went on vacation so far away. He said he was sorry. These words made Dorothea blush even more. Theon then expressed hope that he would recover and return as soon as possible. Dorothea couldn't believe she was truly sorry that she was gone. He looked at the candy and agreed with her. To think that in his previous life he had never felt anything like this. Is he really Theon? But suddenly he forbade himself to think like that. He squeezed the candy in his palm and left, as well as saying that he would go better. Theon wanted to stop him, but he held himself back. Dan clasped his fists and said that he hoped that they would definitely see each other again. He's already gotten on the train and talked himself into being cool. He looked at these candies and thought that no matter how Theon thought about it, his heart was pounding. From these thoughts he smiled and hugged these sweets to himself. The sky is clear blue sea with waves, where white foam comes out along with the waves on the beach hitting the rocks. The gentle breeze pleased Dorothea. The sun is shining bright. Dorothea admired the whole scene. She wore a red dress with her hair tied in 2 ponytails. He couldn't have imagined that he would be able to breathe a sigh of relief once he left the Imperial Palace, the place where he killed Ray and then Theon died. Come to think of it, she only had bad memories in the palace. That's right, everything turned out well. There was no trace of his past when he was the tyrant of this place. He was still looking with a warm smile at the 3 candies Theon had given him. He thought maybe this is where he could start from the beginning. Someone knocked and called her princess. It was the maid of the imperial villa named Clara. It was Clara who was worried for him because she asked him to wait a bit and what if he got lost. He said it now. They should only go with him. Dorothea wondered if she was taking care of a weak princess in such a remote area. It seems because there is no other choice. But Dorothea was just a princess. His concern definitely won't last long. Clara said there was someone she wanted to introduce to her, and a man came up to him. The maid said that she would serve him under his tutelage. He is a bodyguard who will protect him. The bodyguard is named Warrior Stephen Greenwall. He was a tall man with black hair and dark skin. He has a scar over one eye. Dorothea keenly recalled the past, where he sits on his knees in front of her, and she tells him that the princess is calling him, but he is not answering her. With the sword in his hand, there was blood all around him. She called him insolent as usual. He knelt in front of him with an arrow in his stomach. This is a person who has reached the rank of vice captain. Dorothea told him that was too bad because she really wanted to face him. At a time like this, he should have prepared a wise answer. Who will be the vice captain of the light army? Hopefully he doesn't regret his decision. And died in his hands. The scene returns to the present. Dorothea looked at the soldier. He thought that this year he would be 18 years old. It means that he has not joined the Army of Light for a long time. But instead he came to the villa when he had to improve his skills to occupy a higher position. Only for the sake of this weak princess. On second thought, he felt sorry for her. Dorothea seemed to reach out her hand and said beg for her help. The maid was surprised that the princess was good at greeting people too. But all they did was stare at each other. Then Clara said if she had to shake the princess's hand. Dorothea was confused. Instead of a handshake, the guard high-fived her. Clara thought she was being impertinent in front of the princess as usual. Dorothea was already in the hall. Dorothea was sitting in the hall holding paper and pen. He thought that the fact that he had just met Stefan a few minutes ago, he shows that one wish is not enough to live well because life doesn't turn out the way he wants it to. He writes a wish list to live well, so to reach his goal, he needs to make his own criteria. However, he wonders what it means to live well in general. He thought hard and tried to think of something. A waiter approached him and asked him to try the dessert. She brought cakes and tea with milk here. Dorothea pointedly asked Clara what she needed to do to live happily and be a good person. Clara thought at first and then said that first she had to obey her parents. Dorothea said to tell him something else. Clara stopped talking and asked what he was doing. He looked at the piece of paper with the name on it and laughed. Stefan appears behind her and also tries to spy on what she is trying to write from above her. Dorothea suddenly closed the paper and asked angrily and awkwardly why they were laughing. Then Clara said that the princess was very cute and was answered by a nod from Stefan. Dorothea frowned because being a nice person didn't suit her. Then Clara asked her what she made a list like that for. Then Dorothea said she just wanted to be a good person. Then Clara offered him to massage his father 10 times. Dorothea imagined the scene and called it disgusting. Then Clara suggested again to smile 10 times a day. Dorothea thought, smile 10 times. Clara continues that smile is a blessing. Stefan nodded again in tacit approval. Dorothea thought it wasn't like she didn't want to smile. It's just that nothing can make her smile. But sure enough, he remembered Ray. Good people are usually depicted with a smile. Dorothea concluded that there was some truth in Clara's words. He smiled and wondered if it was a smile, and how to do it. He also tried to smile at both of them, but suddenly his mouth twitched. The effort had caused a spasm in his lips. Clara asked what was wrong with him. He pushed them both. He asked them to step out for a while because he wanted to think. Clara says she wants to observe from a closed door. Then Dorothea picked up a pen and wrote a list of the good people she thought she had been. The first is to smile sweetly. Both do not want other people's property, including the throne belonging to Ray, and Theon who belongs to Julia. Third, save 1,000,000 people, because saving people is a commendable deed. In his previous life, there were quite a few people who died because of him. Not only did he finish with his hands, but also those who died in battle, which he made forced laborers, and those affected by disaster, disease, and hunger. The total was probably 500,000 people. People who might have survived had Ray become emperor back then, ended up dying because of him. And to atone for all those sins, in this life, he will save twice that amount. Then Dorothea went on to write a list for living to be a good person. In addition to listening to Thanksgiving 3 times a week and donating 1,000,000 blanc each month to charity. He looked at the list and thought that this was enough for a good life. He went out onto the balcony and looked out over the landscape, and he thought how tired he was. He looked at the shore. Then he approached the servants and told them that he was going to the sea. Stefan and Dorothea were walking along the beach. He looked at Stefan and thought that he said he wanted to go to the sea, and he followed her. But fortunately, he did not interfere and kept quiet. He took off his hat and thought how lonely it was, like there was only him alone at this time. While walking, he saw a young man sitting on the beach. He wondered who the other people living around him were, apart from the residents of the villa. He saw a blonde boy with golden eyes. He saw her crying, where tears streamed down his face. He saw him and recognized him as Ethan Bronte. She is the closest ally of the tyrant Dorothy, a millionaire. He was also the most charming person and the most dangerous man she had ever known. Beck Susie, who looked drunk, called out teasingly and told him to sit near her. But Kwon Dagon thought that he couldn't involve Beck Susie because it would be troublesome later. On the other hand, Lee Seung-hoon, who saw that he was already drunk, started sending messages. After receiving the message, he felt happy because he was sick of waiting. Seeing Beck Susie's behavior, Park Jury scolded her for suddenly doing that and asked her if she wanted to tease Kwon Dagon. When told to wear a jacket, Baek Suzy reasoned that this place was very hot. She then asked Kwon Daegun to pour her a drink. Lee Seung-hoon also offered to pour it, but Baek Suzy told him not to interfere. Baek Suzy then asked Kwon Daegun if he liked girls like Ara, the smart type of girl. Baek Suzy also said that her English was also good, and started mentioning the names of various martial arts techniques. Park Yuri also said that those were all the names of jujitsu techniques. Baek Suzy then invited Kwon Daegun to play jujitsu with her. The winner enslaves the loser. Park Yuri finally got fed up and asked Baek Suzy to go home. At that time, Bang Ho-jung and Jung Min became curious about what Baek Suzy meant by playing jujitsu. In the chairman's office, Seo Ji-in is looking to see if anything has been updated because since yesterday, the chairman seems busy. After Baek Suzy came out, Kim Min-soo found her because he heard it from the listening device, and he asked if he should report to Lee Saim. But Kim Min-soo decided to find out for himself. On the other hand, Park Juri admitted that she wasn't the one who did it, and Baek Suzy suddenly fainted herself. Seeing Baek Suzy's condition, Ara thought that she seemed to be asleep, and she looked like she had been drunk. They also remembered that Lee Seung-hoon mixed something in the drink earlier, but they didn't see where Lee Seung-hoon went. At that time, Lee Seung-hoon was locking the door they entered through. Seeing the liquor that Lee Seung-hoon brought, Kwon Daegun smiled and thought that the party was starting now. But before that, he asked if anyone knew Baek Suzy's house because he wanted to take her. However, Park Juri offered to accompany Baek Suzy. The worried Bang Ho-jung and No Manho asked if she was okay being alone. But Park Juri answered that she had no other choice because she couldn't hand over Baek Suzy who was drunk to them. When she took Baek Suzy away, she was stopped. No Manho became curious because Park Yuri suddenly remained silent. Because it was Baek Suzy, they decided not to bother her, so they decided to beat the boys black and blue. He then asked if Kwon Daegun was having fun, but he was surprised because they didn't look drunk. Kwon Daegun got annoyed because he was just about to get drunk and asked if they had anything to do. They were also annoyed with Lee Seung-hoon because he couldn't do that because the situation was difficult. Hearing their conversation, Jung-min was angry because he thought he was part of their gang. Seeing Jung-min, who was angry, he said that in war, there is no such thing as honesty and justice. You could be stabbed in the back, betrayed, or even killed using a weapon. No Manho, who heard this, agreed that using weapons was a noble act. But he also has to bear the risk if he can be defeated. To divert attention, No Manho asked where he got the stick because it looked expensive, and he answered that he got it by a thief. While distracted, No Manho threw meat at his face. This made him angry, and No Manho challenged him to fight. He accepted it and ordered the rest to attack Kwon Daegun. They were also warned that Kwon Daegun had beaten Midway Road, so don't think of him as a human, but an animal. Kwon Daegun put down his liquor and told Bang Ho-jung and Jung Min to look after Park Yuri and Ara so they wouldn't get involved. But Kwon Daegun thought unless they were idiots, they would definitely just focus on him. Once again, they were warned that Kwon Daegun was very strong. Kwon Daegun then stretched his tie and said that they misjudged something. He told them to raise their weapons because he was ready to do anything, because depending on their abilities, the strength of their fists may change. Hearing Kwon Daegun's provocation, they were very annoyed and said that they had more than 10 armed people. But Kwon Daegun answered with a cold look that he knew, so he wouldn't let them go. In an instant, Kwon Daegun hit 2 people. In an instant. He then rushed to fight them all. Even in front of 10 armed people, Kwon Daegun was able to disarm them by hitting their hands and then kicking them in the stomach. On the other hand, No Manho's opponent was very annoyed because No Manho kept dodging. Hearing his opponent's scolding, No Manho decided to finish this. His opponent was annoyed because No Manho seemed to know his movement patterns. But No Manho said it didn't make sense, and said that he saw that his opponent's stick was real, and he was testing it. He was fed up and swung his bat with all his might, but he was shocked when he saw No Manho disappear. No Manho then appeared from his left side and hit him with his stick. When he tried to reply back, No Manho disappeared from his sight again. Soon after, No Manho appeared from behind and hit him. He wondered why he couldn't see No Manho, but he finally realized when No Manho threw meat at his glasses. No Manho, who was aware of his conscious opponent, mocked him by saying that pork belly fat is delicious but sticky. He was very fed up with No Manho, who had only been swinging to the left, but for No Manho it was too late. With his stick, No Manho finished off his opponent. Having no other choice, they were forced to try to take Park Jury hostage, but Park Jury kicked him in the crotch and grabbed his collar and slammed him down. Park Jury also asked if he thought women couldn't fight. Park Jury then intended to help Kwon Daegun, but the man who Park Jury slammed was still conscious and took his wooden stick. He was very angry and decided not to care anymore and die together. But Park Jury threw herself to protect Baek Suzy. After defeating his opponent, No Manho took his opponent's bat. He then looked at Kwon Daegun's side and thought that he was almost done too. But suddenly No Manho noticed the sandals that had been thrown at Ara. He hit the sandals and asked if she was okay. At that time, Ara blushed because No Manho had saved her. On Kwon Daegun's side, Kwon Daegun finished off his opponents one by one. But when he beat them up, he was stopped because Park Gyuri was taken hostage. He threatened that if Kwon Daegun moved just 1 centimeter, he would cut Park Gyuri. He then assured Park Gyuri that he would let him go if Park Gyuri obeyed him. But suddenly someone attacked him from behind. He was surprised to find that it was Lee Seung-hoon who attacked him. Lee Seung-hoon said it was natural that he always felt uncomfortable being involved with them. They apparently tried to cross the line. Kwon Daegun had thought that Lee Seung-hoon had betrayed him, but he didn't think so. Kwon Daegun then looked at the person he grabbed and finished him off. Then Kwon Daegun demanded Lee Seung-hoon to explain. First of all, Lee Seung-hoon asked Kwon Daegun to calm down and assured him that this was not what Kwon Daegun thought. He admitted that he had lied about him having nothing to do with the sacred lineage, so he apologized about that. Young-min became angry, but he was told to be quiet by Kwon Daegun, and Kwon Daegun told Lee Seung-hoon to finish his story. Lee Seung-hoon explained that it was true that he planned this with them. Initially, they were going to attack Kwon Daegun after Lee Seung-hoon made Kwon Daegun drunk, but when he gave him the drink, he didn't expect that it was Baek Suzy who drank it. Hearing Lee Seung-hoon's story, Kwon Daegun said that he shouldn't make his own decisions and get other people involved, because he couldn't trust Lee Seung-hoon if it was like this. Lee Seung-hoon apologized because he had no choice but to deceive them this time, but he promised not to let this happen again. Kwon Daegun then helped Park Gyuri up and asked if she was okay. After standing up, an annoyed Park Gyuri kicked the person holding her hostage continuously. Kwon Daegun thinks luckily everything is settled, but Kwon Daegun threatens Lee Seung-hoon. If he does this again, then he will lie there. Finally, they decided to clean up this mess. But before that, No Manho told Park Gyuri to calm down because it looked like her wrist was injured. He advised Park Gyuri to go to the doctor first, and he would take care of her. Coincidentally, he wanted to test the skills of the bat he had just acquired. After they thought about it, they didn't know what they should do with Baek Suzy, because Park Gyuri was injured. Because Kwon Daegun was fine, Lee Seung-hoon asked Kwon Daegun to take Baek Suzy home. Kwon Daegun also carried Baek Suzy and asked where Baek Suzy's home address was. Seeing the princess-style carry, Park Gyuri was surprised and offered to take Baek Suzy with her. Kwon Daegun was worried about Park Gyuri's wrist, but Park Gyuri said at least not Kwon Daegun. Jung-min and Bang Ho-jung also offered themselves, but Park Gyuri said that they couldn't either. Because he couldn't be here much longer, Lee Seung-hoon invited Kwon Daegun to leave immediately. On the way, Lee Seung-hoon gave Kwon Daegun his address. He then asked Kwon Daegun if he was okay and told him that he felt bad about all of this. After telling him he was fine, Kwon Daegun told Lee Seung-hoon to just take care of the others as he walked away. At that moment, Jiseok came over to Lee Seung-hoon. When asked why he was here, Jiseok answered that he heard that Baek Suzy was drunk, so he wanted to offer to take her home. But before Jiseok finished his sentence, Lee Seung-hoon told him not to. Kwon Daegun became curious about what they were talking about, but Lee Seung-hoon told him not to worry and invited Jiseok to come with him for a while. He thanked Jiseok for telling him that Baek Suzy was drunk with just 1 glass. But Park Gyuri knew Baek Suzy's address, so she didn't need Jiseok anymore and said that she could go. But Jiseok said that he could just take Baek Suzy to her house, because Baek Suzy had bad drinking habits, and she would act violently. However, Lee Seung-hoon told Jiseok to go home and rest, because he didn't feel well. Jiseok was confused about what he meant, even though he didn't feel unwell. Suddenly, Lee Seung-hoon kicked Jiseok. Lee Seung-hoon smiled and said he already told you that he wasn't feeling well. Luckily, Kwon Daegun said he would accompany Baek Suzy, so he told Jiseok to just stay here as a spectator. But Jiseok panicked because when Baek Suzy was drunk, she had a habit of doing jujitsu. If Kwon Daegun went to Baek Suzy's house in conditions like this, Jiseok was sure something bad would happen. Not long after, Baek Suzy slowly regained consciousness. She was then surprised to find that she was being carried by Kwon Daegun. Her face turned red and she asked why she was being carried by Kwon Daegun. At that time, Kwon Daegun thought that he was too conspicuous and that many people were staring at him. When he saw a taxi, he was about to get into the taxi. But Baek Suzy suddenly pretended to be delirious and said that she didn't feel well and she could vomit in the car. Kwon Daegun also asked Baek Suzy if she was awake, but Baek Suzy didn't answer. When asked by the taxi driver, Kwon Daegun apologized for not getting on. Baek Suzy thought that she didn't want to stop being carried. He didn't know if this was a dream or not, but she wanted to stay like this. At that time, Kwon Daegun thought that he had no other choice. He didn't mean to do this, but he decided to use flow. The taxi driver was annoyed because Kwon Daegun didn't take a taxi, but he was surprised when he saw Kwon Daegun running quickly. He became excited and thought that Kwon Daegun was inviting him to race. He intends to show his experience as a taxi driver for 20 years at the age of 57. Not long after, at the hospital, they received a patient who had hit a telephone pole while driving a taxi. They didn't understand why he was speeding, even though he was in a children's area where the speed limit is 30 miles per hour. At that time, Kim Min-soo found Seo Ji-woon's room. He felt like he had heard that name before. In Seo Ji-woon's room, Seo Ji-in spoke to the unconscious Seo Ji-woon and began to tell him about his school life. Kim Min-soo was curious about whether Seo Ji-woon was Seo Ji-in's younger brother. He thought that he shouldn't make his own decisions and wanted to report to director Lee Saim, but he was discovered by Seo Ji-in, which made him nervous. On the other hand, Kwon Daegun finally arrived at Baek Suzy's house. When he entered Baek Suzy's house, someone who was secretly following him took a photo of Kwon Daegun entering while carrying Baek Suzy. After entering the house, when he tried to say hello, Kwon Daegun found no one in the house. He then woke Baek Suzy and told her that they had arrived at her house, but Baek Suzy reasoned that she couldn't walk to bed by herself. Kwon Daegun had no other choice and put Baek Suzy on the bed. After putting Baek Suzy down, he said that he would leave now. He really couldn't believe that Baek Suzy could get drunk like that with just one drink. After saying goodbye, Kwon Daegun suddenly grabbed by his collar and he was crushed by Baek Suzy. Kwon Daegun didn't understand what Baek Suzy was doing, but Baek Suzy said that he had told him that she invited him to play jujitsu, and the loser would be enslaved. Hearing Baek Suzy's invitation, Kwon Daegun answered that he didn't want to play jujitsu or enslave, so he told Baek Suzy to step aside. But Baek Suzy refused and said that this time she wanted to make sure Kwon Daegun knew who was more powerful. Baek Suzy is currently pressing her knee on Kwon Daegun's stomach. That is the knee on belly technique, a technique that places the knee on the opponent's stomach to apply pressure. Baek Suzy also said that the only way for Kwon Daegun to escape from here was to beat her. Kwon Daegun thought that he couldn't hold it in anymore and had to escape from this place as quickly as possible. He also pushed Baek Suzy's knee to get free, but Baek Suzy immediately caught Kwon Daegun and locked his shoulders. Baek Suzy then whispered to Kwon Daegun that it wasn't that easy. If Kwon Daegun pushes his knees and feet, then she will hold the side like this. Kwon Daegun thought that this would be easy, but Baek Suzy's grip was so strong that there was almost no gap at all. Therefore, he decided to be serious. The technique used by Kwon Daegun is called bridge. It is a technique that uses core muscle strength to lift the opponent above and create distance. Core muscle strength plays a very important role. And in the past, Kwon Daegun trained his core muscles for the first time and never neglected it in the slightest, making Kwon Daegun's core muscles far beyond ordinary people. Baek Suzy was surprised by the strength of Kwon Daegun's back. With the next step, the distance widened. Baek Suzy's mistake was that she chose to hug Kwon Daegun tighter, because when he tightened his grip on her neck, his hands might lose control. And when he lost his balance, he did a sweep, namely moving up from a position below him to a position above him. On the other hand, Seo Ji-in was surprised to see Kim Min-soo. Kim Min-soo immediately acted like they met by chance and reasoned that his father had breast cancer. Seo Ji-in was confused by Kim Min-soo, who said he had breast cancer. After being quite far from Seo Ji-in, Kim Min-soo called Lee Saim and reported that Baek Suzy from Class 1, 9, was probably targeting the chairman. Hearing the report, Lee Saim replied that he had a schedule, so he would contact him again. The chairman asked what was wrong and advised Lee Saim to just go home. Lee Saim was a little hesitant to leave, but the chairman said he would meet President Park here today and they could talk tomorrow. President Park said that Lee Saim looked good and asked if he was the one looking after him. The chairman laughed and said that President Park's joke was funny. He said that they had often seen things like that. What they will see now is a completely different world. President Park laughed and said that he got a little nervous when he said that. As he was about to pass by, Park President was stopped and told that this was a construction site, and because it was dangerous, they were restricting access. President Park becomes nervous, but the chairman assures him that this is just a formality and there is no need to be afraid. They were finally allowed to enter. President Park, who was a little scared, asked if it was usually like this. The chairman answered that this was not normal because currently there was business with President Park. He told them that now, President Park no longer needed to bring a lot of money to come to them and asked them to expand his knowledge step by step, because this content only the selected can enjoy. This content is a struggle for true masculinity that fights solely for the sake of victory. Not long after, they found two people fighting. They were stopped by the guards. The man who beat his opponent was angry because the person he beat was an athlete who was going to fight soon, but he didn't care at all. He even said that they should be grateful because there was no point in him fighting if his level was only that much. Chairman Park is confused about what is going on, but the chairman tells him that he is just an overzealous person and that happens often. President Park then asked what the chairman had said before. The chairman answered he was right and told him that it was the athlete's waiting room. President Park became very nervous because he could feel the aura of a wild animal behind the door. He fell and asked if there was really a human inside. At that time, someone helped President Park to stand up. That person then lowered his head and greeted the chairman. When asked by the chairman what his name was, the person introduced himself as Ham Sun-jin. He is a third-grade Grumryong High School student. Ham Sun-jin then asked if the chairman wanted to go to the waiting room, but the chairman said that he had to meet someone first and told Ham Sun-jin to take good care of himself. President Park didn't expect to see a student from the chairman's school, but the chairman said that he had already told him that the athletes who would appear were students from his school. Ham Sun-jin entered the waiting room and greeted Baek Soo-yuk. He then asked why he was clicking the lamp so scary. On the other hand, the chairman came to meet the person he wanted to meet. He was greeted and asked why he was so late. The chairman then asked who the athlete was, but he said he wasn't there and he was hiding it. But if the chairman found out, he was sure the chairman would be very surprised. Back at Kwon Daegun's place, Kwon Daegun is still fighting jujitsu with Baek Suzy. He thought Baek Suzy just talked a lot, but Baek Suzy was much better than he thought. He didn't understand why Baek Suzy was so strong. Kwon Daegun then counterattacked, and Baek Suzy was trapped again. He didn't understand because in jujitsu, if you don't know anything, you will be beaten. At that moment, Kwon Daegun turned things around and finally managed to catch Baek Suzy. Baek Suzy's hands looked like they were in handcuffs. Baek Suzy said that this was cheating, but Kwon Daegun said that he didn't care, and then asked if that was her blanket over her head. Baek Suzy answered that it was true, and asked what was wrong with the blanket while being embarrassed. Suddenly, Kwon Daegun wrapped Baek Suzy in the blanket. Kwon Daegun sighed, and said that if he didn't do this, there would be no end to it. As he walked away, he said that he would leave now. When he left Baek Suzy's house, Kwon Daegun felt so hot that he was sweating. But at that time he was photographed by Kim Samuel, and the photo was sent to Ham Sun-jin. As soon as he received the photo, Ham Sun-jin was shocked. Because he was surprised, he accidentally said Baek Suzy's name. Baek Soo-yuk also snatched his cell phone from Ham Sun-jin. Ham Sun-jin said that the source was a bit unclear, and he didn't know who the sender was, and neither did the man in the photo, so he didn't know what happened. So he advised Baek Soo-yuk not to make a decision too quickly, and that he would come back soon. Baek Soo-hyuk also crushed Ham Sun-jin's cell phone and told Ham Sun-jin to find out now. After struggling on the bed, Baek Suzy finally let go of herself, who was wrapped in a blanket. She also discovered that Kwon Daegun had left in a hurry. She felt disappointed, but AHE was confused as to why the bed was so messy. The match they had been waiting for, namely Baek Soo-hyuk's fight, was finally about to start. They immediately went to watch it. When arriving at the arena, the referee introduced the fighter who would fight, namely the Hound from Hell, Magma. When he saw the fighter, he was told that Magma was from Daegu. Even so, the skill is very hot, so it's fine. Then, the referee introduced the King of Beasts, Baek Soo-hyuk. Magma spat because he was annoyed that people worshipped him. He was curious as to what the person was like, but he was surprised when a lion entered the arena. He felt this was an exaggeration, but he thought at least he was still an ordinary human. When Baek Soo-hyuk stared at him, the referee understood and told him that he was not his opponent, but the other man. Ham Sun-jin was worried because it could be Baek Suzy's fault that made Baek Soo-hyuk go crazy. But he thought that if he saw that photo, it would be difficult to stay sane, especially for his brother. But he asked Baek Soo-hyuk not to worry, because he, Ham Sun-jin, had been his lackey for 10 years. Before the match, the referee explained that there were a few precautions. Before he could explain, Magma ran towards Baek Soo-hyuk and said he didn't care about things like that. He tried to punch Baek Soo-hyuk and Baek Soo-hyuk received his punch. Everyone was shocked to see Baek Soo-hyuk hit hard. Magma didn't waste the opportunity and continued to beat Baek Soo-hyuk. The nervous Chairman Park said that it seemed the chairman's condition was not good. They believed that Baek Soo-hyuk was strong, but he was not someone who would just accept attacks. So they believed Baek Soo-hyuk couldn't concentrate on the match. Baek Soo-hyuk also provoked Baek Soo-hyuk, who didn't fight back at all, and continued to beat him. But the last blow made Magma feel strange. He then turned around and asked the referee if he was joking. He also grabbed Baek Soo-hyuk's hair and asked if he was serious about not competing, because he didn't come to hit the punching bag. Magma said that he had explored the national competition scene to get here. They say here he can fight until someone dies. Therefore, he believes he must be prepared to kill or be killed in order to be enjoyable. Then suddenly Baek Soo-hyuk attacked back. Magma knelt down and vomited blood in one blow. Magma was very surprised. At that very moment, the chairman said in the ancient Roman Empire, they put lions and men into the Colosseum to fight, in eat or eat, a real game of life or death. So he asked President Park who he thought would win. On the other hand, Magma stood up again and said that he had let his guard down. An excited Magma says that's good, as he doesn't need to hold back anymore and launches his punch. But Baek Soo-hyuk quickly hit Magma's arm hard. Baek Soo-hyuk then immediately hit Magma in the ribs. Magma vomited blood again. When his head was grabbed, Magma asked to wait a moment, but Baek Soo-hyuk ignored him and punched Magma's hand and face at the same time, breaking Magma's finger. To finish him off, Baek Soo-hyuk once again punched Magma in the face. The chairman said, "For humans, even a small lion attack is fatal and life-threatening. In the Colosseum, humans and lions do not compete. No one expected humans to win. Watching lions hunting is just for fun." Baek Soo-hyuk approached Magma and asked if he had just asked why he came here. He told him that he had a beautiful and adorable younger sister. For him, he can do anything. He said that he wanted to show it to Magma, but unfortunately the reason Magma came here was to fight to the death. Gladiator drew his sword bravely, but once he faced the lion, he realized he had no choice but to die. Magma begged Baek Soo-hyuk that he didn't have to compete anymore, and he didn't want to continue. But Baek Soo-hyuk ignored him and continued to walk towards him, making Magma scared and screaming for help. He even said that he would return all the money, but Baek Soo-hyuk grabbed Magma's leg and apologized because that was impossible, because the side that knocks out pays more, so he can buy Baek Suzy delicious food. At school, when No Manhwa and the others looked for Kwon Daegun, they found the students queuing. They found out that they were actually lining up to meet Kwon Daegun. Kwon Daegun sighed and told them to leave because he was studying, but Kim Myung-jung asked Kwon Daegun to listen until the end. Not long after, Baek Suzy walked among the others. Kim Myung-jung still begs and says even the smallest help is useful. At that moment, Baek Suzy kicked Kim Myung-jung hard. She told Kim Myung-jung to stop bothering him and left. Jinmo was angry at Kim Myung-jung because he should have been kicked by Baek Suzy. Baek Suzy then called Kwon Daegun, but was ignored. She also grabbed Kwon Daegun by the collar. Kwon Daegun sighed and took off his glasses. Baek Suzy was immediately amazed to see him, but she scolded Kwon Daegun about yesterday. Because he was too fierce, the bed was broken. Everyone was shocked to hear that. At that time, Baek Suzy asked Kwon Daegun to take responsibility. Hearing that, Kwon Daegun told Baek Suzy to speak clearly, but Baek Suzy said that she didn't know and just told Kwon Daegun to take responsibility. Apart from that, Baek Suzy also said that the blanket was wet from sweat, so it was difficult to wash. At that time, Ham Sun-jin, who was listening, was very angry. He didn't understand why this happened, but he calmed himself down because Baek Suzy was now an adult. He also remembered when Baek Suzy was little. At that time, little Baek Suzy, who saw Ham Sun-jin buying ice cream, told him to buy her one too. And when he was late, he was beaten. But Ham Sun-jin still thinks the old Baek Suzy was cute. But he thought this wasn't what was important right now, and he couldn't just let it go. Seeing Ham Sun-jin leaving, Kwon Daegun became curious because he had never seen him. But Baek Suzy scolded him for changing the topic. Lee Seung-hoon then interrupted and called for their attention. He asked them to take a moment to have a meeting together, except for Baek Suzy. After everyone gathered, Lee Seung-hoon told him that the person was Ham Sun-jin from Class 3. So he concluded that Class 3 had started to move. They didn't expect that there would be a third grader acting like a first grader. Lee Seung-hoon explained that thanks to his face, Ham Sun-jin does not have a unique presence. He became Baek Soo-hyuk's errand boy, which means he came here to spy on Kwon Daegun. If he made a move, that meant the third graders would probably make a move too. More precisely, Baek Soo-hyuk and his 4 subordinates, who are more often known as the 4 executives. They also think that their nickname is very childish. If there were only 4, Jong-min thought it would definitely be fast. But Lee Seung-hoon warned not to underestimate them just because their names were childish or their numbers were small. Because Gumryong controls the Daejeon area, that means Baek Soo-hyuk and his 4 subordinates control power in the Daejeon area, with just the 5 of them. Those 4 people, compared to the second-year kids or whoever they had fought so far, they were on a different level. At that time, Kwon Daegun asked when the midterm exam would be held. Lee Seung-hoon answered 3 weeks later and asked why he asked. Kwon Daegun answered that he had to study for the midterm exam. He said the exam was important, so no matter how many there were, he told them to come as soon as possible. Lee Seung-hoon didn't expect Kwon Daegun to be serious enough about studying and offered his notes. Kwon Daegun was surprised that Lee Seung-hoon would lend something that valuable and wanted to learn as soon as possible. At that time, Lee Seung-hoon thought that he had sent the photo as an inducement, but he didn't know what they were doing or where they were. So he was curious about what would happen. On the other hand, Ham Sun-jin was checking the chat group of 4 executives. He was annoyed because his message was ignored. He wanted to tell Baek Soo-hyuk, but because Baek Soo-hyuk was busy, he decided to take care of this alone. At a tutoring center, the tutoring students have just finished tutoring. Among them was a large man wearing glasses. While he was on his way home, a group of thugs were harassing someone, but noticing the bespectacled man, the thug called him too. Seeing the appearance of the bespectacled man who was like a model student, he laughed at him. But he was surprised when he realized that the man wearing glasses was bigger than he expected. The man with glasses tried to see what was going on. The thug asked what he was looking at but was ignored. He then slaps him and asks if he can't read the situation. But suddenly his hand was caught. He then had his arm twisted and hit in the chest. Another thug who witnessed this asked if the man with the glasses was crazy. The bespectacled man straightened his collar and asked if they were ready to fight. Not long after, the leader of the thugs arrived while embracing a woman. He told them to beat the man with glasses and then leave. They ran towards the man with glasses and attacked him. But the man wearing glasses hit them in the face and elbowed the last thug in the face. The other thug stood up again and attacked the man with glasses again. But he caught his fist and hit him hard. The thug leader realized his subordinates were overwhelmed, so he took out his knife. Seeing the leader take out a knife, the man with glasses said that if you want to use a weapon, only those who are experts can use it. The thug leader tried to slash the man with glasses, but the man with glasses avoided him and caught his hand. He then quickly finished him off. The woman who witnessed it was frightened and threatened the man with glasses that he had been recorded and would be reported. But the man wearing glasses knocked the woman unconscious and took her cell phone. After deleting the video, the man wearing glasses told Ham's son Jin, who was watching, to remain silent. He then asked why Ham's son Jin was here, but Ham's son Jin asked why he was here, and he and the other executives did not reply to messages. The man with glasses is Hanam Bai, one of the 4 executives. He told Ham's son Jin to mind his own business. An exasperated Ham's son Jin says he won't get preferential treatment just because he attends school. Ham's son Jin then said that because the situation was urgent, he would let it go this time. He said there was a new kid who needed to be acted on because he had challenged the 2nd graders. Even when Baek Soo-hyuk wasn't around, he acted like the chairman of Gumryong. So he told Hanam Bae to come to school and teach the 1st graders a lesson. But Hanam Bae didn't want to. He then said he didn't want to use pencil case on him, so he told Ham Sun Jin to find someone else. Ham Sun Jin was angry and said he would never forget this as he ran. He was annoyed because he thought Hanam Bae would at least understand. 3 of the other 4 executives are all crazy, but with this situation, Ham Sun Jin has no choice to choose someone who likes to go overboard, but whose abilities are solid. In a warehouse, while people were fighting, the cell phone there rang. The owner of the cell phone answered the phone. Hearing what Ham Sun Jin said, he said just give him a list of people and the number of people he had to kill. The man Ham Sun Jin called was one of the 4 executives, An Ha-gon. Chapter 59. In the school cafeteria, Bang Ho-jong, who was hungry, asked which bread he should eat so that he could be the topic of conversation among people. He also jumped into the queue to order 3 sausage patties. A girl was surprised to see Bang Ho-jong jumping into the queue, but was shocked when she heard from her friend that Bang Ho-jong was a 1st grader. He thought there must be something wrong, but his friend said he didn't think so. In fact, instead of jumping into the queue, the other boys moved aside by themselves. The girl was curious about why Class 3 students were afraid of Class 1 students. Her friend also told her that they were a group of Class 1 students, Kwon Daegun. When talking about Kwon Daegun, he knew that he was a student who was known to be aggressive and unforgiving, and also handsome. They then enthusiastically talked about Kwon Daegun. The male students who witnessed this became irritated with Kwon Daegun, and talked about the incident between Kwon Daegun and Baek Suzy. Ham Sun Jin, who heard this, felt annoyed because even though he had told the others, including An Ha-gon, they were talking nonsense. In Kwon Daegun's class, Lee Seung-hoon told him that he found an important person in Class 3 besides the 4 executives named Chun Shim. Hearing that, Bang Ho-jong and Jong Min were about to mock his name, but were stopped by No Man-ho because he himself was nicknamed No Manners Fighter. When asked what Lee Seung-hoon meant, he answered that he just wanted them to be careful because there was someone like that in Class 3. In Class 3, the boys complained because Class 1 had become quite bold lately. But the girls defended Kwon Daegun. Because there was no Baek Soo-hyuk or 4 executives, they asked the remaining Chun Shim who could help them. Chun Shim replies that she understands and tells them to leave. After they left, Ham Sun Jin came and asked for help about Kwon Daegun from Class 1. Because everyone was talking about Kwon Daegun, Chun Shim became curious about Kwon Daegun. The big man in front of Chun Shim asked if she had finished practicing makeup. When he failed, Chun Shim told him to wash his face. Ham Sun Jin then asked Chun Shim to talk for a moment. Chun Shim says yes, but she's just playing games. Finally he finished and asked Ham Sun Jin if he wanted him to call the 4 executives. He said that he could talk to Baek Soo-hyuk, but Ham Sun Jin said that Baek Soo-hyuk was busy. Having no other choice, Chun Shim decided to give Kwon Daegun a lesson directly. In the cafeteria, Kwon Daegun was listening to a story about Chun Shim, who could move 4 executives while eating. No Man-ho said his wild instincts told him that Chun Shim was a dangerous person. Kwon Daegun felt it was very childish, but suddenly Chun Shim appeared behind him. After confirming he was Kwon Daegun, Chun Shim told him his name and told Kwon Daegun to come with him. Kwon Daegun initially ignored him, but after being scolded, he finally agreed. Seeing Kwon Daegun standing, Chun Shim was surprised to find that Kwon Daegun was very big. Behind the school building, Chun Shim, who thought he was older, scolded Kwon Daegun. But Kwon Daegun, who was actually older, thought of her as a little girl. Annoyed because Kwon Daegun didn't listen to her, Chun Shim was about to hit him, but her fist slowed down and slowly touched Kwon Daegun. He was then satisfied because he had beaten Kwon Daegun. Kwon Daegun was surprised that Chun Shim thought it was a blow. Chun Shim warned that if Kwon Daegun's attitude continued like this, he would die. So he gave advice because he cared about his underclassmen. Seeing Chun Shim, Kwon Daegun felt like he saw a chihuahua. Chun Shim then felt that she had gone too far in reprimanding Kwon Daegun, and said she would stop today. But Kwon Daegun stopped him because he had something to talk about. Chun Shim blushes and says that she is not interested in younger guys. At that time, An Hagen was watching them. Kwon Daegun asked about the 4 executives because he knew they were targeting him. But suddenly someone interrupted them. Kwon Daegun also saw Gu Xianghua appear. Gu Xianghua said that he had learned from his mistakes in their last fight. Therefore, he concluded that ordinary techniques would not work on Kwon Daegun. So he prepared a technique that was far more destructive than existing techniques. He jumped on his subordinates and they pushed Gu Xianghua until he sped off. Gu Xianghua then issued a dropkick. Kwon Daegun also got rid of Chun Shim and finished off Gu Xianghua in one blow. Seeing Chun Shim in pain, Kwon Daegun apologized and offered to help her up. Baek Suzy said it wasn't her fault, and she was just shocked. Ham Sun Jin, who saw this, immediately ran and asked Chun Shim to go to the hospital. Chun Shim says she is fine, but Ham Sun Jin insists. He then glared at Kwon Daegun, but Kwon Daegun admitted it wasn't his doing. Then Kwon Daegun realized that he was someone in his class. But Ham Sun Jin ran away with Chun Shim. At that time, Gu Xianghua was sad because his pro wrestling technique failed and asked what other technique he should use. Kwon Daegun also blamed Gu Xianghua that this was all his fault. He also summoned Gu Xianghua's subordinates to punish them. An Hagon, who witnessed this, thought he came here just to reprimand the impudent first graders. But he was excited to see the look in Kwon Daegun's eyes. He thought it would be a shame for him to eat such a delicious man just like that. Not long after, a teacher approached him. When he recognized An Hagen's face, he was about to scold him, but he lost consciousness and lost his memory of why he was lying there. When he came home from school, Kwon Daegun was annoyed with Gu Xianghua. When punishing Gu Xianghua, he wanted to tell something about the 4 executives. But Lee Seung-hoon came and asked if he needed his notes. Kwon Daegun also told Gu Xianghua to talk about it later. But Gu Xianghua said it was important information, and he would wait for Kwon Daegun. Kwon Daegun didn't expect that Gu Xianghua would actually wait until the school bell and even attack him again with a strange technique. While looking in the mirror, Kwon Daegun thought maybe it was time to shave his head. At that moment, he saw someone running towards him and attacking him. Kwon Daegun avoided him and asked what he was doing here. But An Hagen asked who he was. Kwon Daegun also understood that An Hagen had no intention of introducing himself. An Hagen laughed and said he didn't need to care about that. He also threw kicks at Kwon Daegun. Kwon Daegun was curious if his opponent was one of the 4 executives. Seeing his strange clothes, he thought it was hard to tell if he was a student. So if he was a civilian, then he couldn't hurt him. But if he attacked as if he wanted to kill, then he couldn't promise he wouldn't get hurt. On the other hand, Lee Seung-hoon said goodbye to the other students and then found Gu Xianghua. He also asked what they were doing because school hours had long ended. He told him that he was serving his sentence, but was not told when he could go home. Lee Seung-hoon realized that it was Kwon Daegun's punishment and asked why Gu Xianghua was standing up himself. He said standing like this was still his punishment. To change the topic, Lee Seung-hoon asked what he had been talking about with Kwon Daegun all that time. Gu Xianghua said it was about the 4 executives and asked Lee Seung-hoon what he wanted to hear. Gu Xianghua's subordinate really didn't want that to happen because it would add 1 hour and asked him to just leave. Gu Xianghua ignored him and started telling the story. The 4 executives in a region are also called the 4 Golden Waters. They come from the same area and are friends with each other. Hearing Gu Xianghua start to say that his subordinates were no longer strong and said goodbye to Gu Xianghua. Gu Xianghua ignored him and continued to tell him that they were so strong that they were known to everyone. But these days, rather than strong, a more suitable word to describe them is cruel. The second strongest person in their previous class, Oh Sodok, played a survival battle game at a construction site. But An Hagon came to them and asked who was the strongest. Gu Seonghwa was about to claim to be the strongest, but Oh Sodok stopped him, and he told him his name. An Hagon praised that the name was good and started to stand up. Oh Sodok also said that he didn't care about seniority and invited him to finish it now. Oh Sodok was ready and launched a punch. An Hagen dodged it and found his opponent a southpaw. An Hagen easily dodged Oh Sodok's attack. Oh Sodok was very annoyed because his opponent was very slippery. Gu Seonghwa, who watched their fight, was curious about how to dodge An Hagon because he had never seen a move like that. He wondered if the soft movement was helping him dodge. Oh Sodok was very angry because An Hagen was writhing everywhere. While reading the next move, An Hagen caught and locked Oh Sodok's arm. Oh Sodok screamed in pain, and the others were shocked. An Hagen laughed at him and asked if his shoulder had just been dislocated. He continuously taunted Oh Sodok, such as telling him to change the name of Oh Sodok's technique. Gu Seonghwa, who was watching, thought that they should stop it. So when An Hagen wanted to continue, Gu Seonghwa stopped him because if he continued, it could cause serious injury. But An Hagen ran towards Oh Sodok and said that was exactly what he wanted. Gu Seonghwa then tried to stop An Hagen, but he was caught by An Hagen. When his subordinates wanted to help, An Hagen threatened that if they approached, he couldn't guarantee what would happen to Gu Seonghwa. Seeing Gu Seonghwa's subordinates who were hesitating, An Hagen laughed, calling them stupid, because if it was him, he would still go forward. After that, Gu Seonghwa was unconscious, and when he woke up, half of them were lying on the ground. It was the first time he felt what it was like to come face to face with one of the 4 executives. Gu Seonghwa's story is finally finished. Seeing Gu Seonghwa's pose, he was curious when he got the invisible chair. Out of curiosity, Lee Sung-hoon asked why Gu Seonghwa, who was obsessed with information, told him this. Gu Seonghwa also said that when the injury he received almost destroyed him and his friends, he thought it was a very serious situation. But for some reason the next day the pain disappeared. He didn't know what kind of trick An Hagen used, so he just wanted to research it. Hearing that story, Lee Seung-hoon thought that he felt like cheering for Kwon Daegun. Gu Seonghwa then wanted to continue his story, but Lee Seung-hoon stopped him. In essence, he said that An Hagen was an opponent who would not be easy to beat. On the other hand, Kwon Daegun had planted his fist on An Hagen's face until he bled. Because An Hagen still had not answered his question, Kwon Daegun threatened An Hagen that he would lose the opportunity to answer. Ham Sun-jin was annoyed when he saw a message from An Hagen saying he was fighting outside, because discipline should be given at school so that people can see. But he realized from the photo that the location was near the school, so he quickly ran to the location to stop them. Seeing Ham Sun-jin running, Lee Seung-hoon became curious about where he was running in such a hurry, and ran after him. Gu Seonghwa also came because he was told to, but he was surprised to see that Ham Sun-jin was fat, but could run fast. Apart from that, the way he runs is also strange. On the other hand, An Hagen thought this was interesting, and asked who Kwon Daegun really was. He felt that Kwon Daegun's body, movements and parry were abnormal. So he doubted that Kwon Daegun was a first grader. Kwon Daegun was sure that An Hagen was not questioning the project he was doing. But the world's most famous fighter at 16 looked older than him, so he thought he should be safe too. Kwon Daegun decided to just be careful. Since he's probably a civilian, he'll finish this in one hit. Seeing Kwon Daegun walking carelessly, An Hagen thought he had let his guard down. But in an instant, Kwon Daegun defeated him. Ham Sun-jin finally arrived and was shocked to see An Hagen, who had lost. Even Gu Seonghwa was surprised to see Kwon Daegun, who had defeated An Hagen, one of the executives. On the other hand, at the game center, Chun Shim is happy because she can finally relieve stress after beating the game. He was a little annoyed with Kwon Daegun earlier, but he thought Kwon Daegun was still a new kid, so he was still a kid. Because he thinks so, he feels proud and thinks he has grown up. On the other hand, he thought Ham Sun-jin's attitude was immature to the point of calling 4 executives to discipline the new student. Returning to Kwon Daegun's side, he discovered that his opponent was one of the 4 executives. When he wanted to wake An Hagen, he was suddenly attacked by An Hagen. However, Kwon Dagon was able to react and throw On Hagen. On Hagen was also impressed with Kwon Dagon. After that, he complained because the medicine he was taking took a long time to take effect. Ham Sun-jin became nervous because he actually took combat stimulant medication. On Hagen said he had no choice but to fight someone he couldn't beat. He thought this was not just a matter of disciplining an impudent first grader. Because Kwon Dagon is not cheap food from the canteen for him, but a dangerous meal. He believes Kwon Dagon is not an ordinary civilian. Hearing that, Ham Sun-jin had no other choice to finish this now, and told Lee Seong-hoon and Gu Seong-hwa to see Kwon Dagon's defeat. He shouted at Kwon Dagon that his history was over. Kwon Dagon thought On Hagen's energy felt different, as if he were in an immersion state, but he felt something was wrong. On Hagen rushed to punch Kwon Dagon, but Kwon Dagon avoided it and responded with an uppercut. On Hagen avoided it with a smile, then caught Kwon Dagon's hand. Kwon Dagon launched a punch to keep On Hagen away, but he dodged and wrapped it around Kwon Dagon's arm. Gu Seong-hwa recognized the move because it was the technique that dislocated Oh Sodok's shoulder. As soon as your opponent throws a punch, wrap your arm around the outside of the attack, hook it, and press down. But On Hagen was surprised to see Kwon Dagon's fist and barely avoided it. He was annoyed because this time it didn't work either. He didn't understand what happened. He believes he previously failed due to a lack of skill in executing. He thought Kwon Dagon's reflexes were much higher, but concluded that was impossible. Gu Seong-hwa asked whether the purpose of wrapping his arms around him was not just aiming for victory, but with the intention of paralyzing the opponent as well. But Lee Seong-hoon was sure it wouldn't work on Kwon Dagon. Ham Sun-jin laughed and called them stupid because they didn't know anything. He tempts them to teach them, but they don't want to. Gu Seong-hwa became angry because he couldn't get any information. Ham Sun-jin believes On Hagen's current abilities have exceeded human limits. This is not something that a first grader cannot understand, and it is absorption, hyperfocus, or metacognitive awareness. He uses the potential of his brain. When that happens, not only the mind, but also physical abilities can exceed their limits, thereby releasing peak human performance. When using hyperfocus and immersion, time slows down, bringing clarity to the surrounding area as if flipping a freeze frame to capture the right moment. On Hagen launched his right hand. Kwon Dagon, who saw that, thought it was slow and avoided it. On Hagen immediately turned his hand and aimed for his neck. When his hand was caught, it immediately wrapped around his arm. He was sure that now Kwon Dagon had been hit, but Kwon Dagon was still able to avoid it, surprising On Hagen. Kwon Dagon tried to attack back, but On Hagen was still able to avoid it. Kwon Dagon got really annoyed and thought he was even more annoying than Gu Seong-hwa. But apart from all that, he noticed that On Hagen's movements had changed drastically. Reflexes, reaction speed, even physical abilities. So he asked On Hagen if he was in an immersion state. Lee Seong-hoon and Gu Seong-hwa did not understand what Kwon Dagon was talking about. But Ham Sun-jin was surprised that the first graders knew about this. But Kwon Dagon thought he felt some kind of sense of dissonance. And he also heard it clearly earlier, when On Hagen said something about medicine. He got a headache thinking about it, but he decided to compare it with the original to find out. Chun-shim is very upset about losing the game. He was also scolded by the thugs who were playing, making Chun-shim nervous. On the other hand, Gu Seong-hwa felt that Kwon Dagon's atmosphere had changed. At that very moment, Kwon Dagon challenged On Hagen to come to him. On Hagen got annoyed and ran towards him. He was about to launch a punch, but Kwon Dagon punched him in the face. On Hagen didn't understand what happened and wondered why he was hit even though he didn't see the attack. Ham Sun-jin also scolded On Hagen for being hit by a Class 1 kid. On Hagen finally got fed up with Ham Sun-jin and thought that he would finish him later after defeating Kwon Dagon. But suddenly a kick flew at him. He was able to avoid it, but then Kwon Dagon launched his punch. On Hagen became confused because Kwon Dagon suddenly became fast, so there was no room to catch him. Then he saw Kwon Dagon's kick. He caught him, and thought that he finally caught Kwon Dagon. But he was knocked out by Kwon Dagon. At that moment, On Hagen felt something strange. Kwon Dagon then told On Hagen to do it properly, because there was something he wanted to check. On Hagen swung his leg and launched a punch at Kwon Dagon. Kwon Dagon avoided it and landed an uppercut on Hagen. An Hagen kept trying to fight back, but Kwon Dagon kept avoiding him and hitting him in the face continuously. An Hagen finally fell down. Ham Sun Jin was surprised that An Hagen, who was in the zone, was pushed back. An Hagen was annoyed because this didn't make sense because his fist came out first. But Kwon Dagon's punch always reached first. In the hyper-focus zone, you can win against your opponent even in a simple game like rock, paper, scissors by seeing what your opponent does using dynamic visuals. But he who is in the zone cannot even win. Gu Seonghwa also thought Kwon Dagon would win this fight. Even Lee Seong-hoon agreed. Kwon Dagon has responded to attacks several times. It didn't matter even though An Hagon could read Kwon Dagon's movements. An angry Ham Sun Jin grabbed Lee Seong-hoon by the collar and told him to stop pretending to know and asked if he was smart. But after seeing it, Lee Seong-hoon looked very smart. He then said that life is not based on values. Lee Seong-hoon was surprised because he never talked about grades. Ham Sun Jin told An Hagen's weapon wasn't actually something like a punch. At that time, An Hagen thought he could see the blow. The problem was that as soon as he saw Kwon Dagon's fist, he was already hit. But the most important thing is that he can see. Because Kwon Dagon's boxing was faster than him, An Hagen decided to let Kwon Dagon win the rock, paper, scissor. Then when Kwon Dagon launched his punch, An Hagen caught his hand. But Kwon Dagon forced him roughly. Kwon Dagon was very fed up with An Hagen, who kept sticking to him. Lee Seong-hoon and Gu Seonghwa were surprised by Kwon Dagon, who ignored An Hagen's catch and hit him forcefully. Ham Sun Jin was surprised to see An Hagen, who was defeated. Kwon Dagon told Ham Sun Jin to wake An Hagen and take him, because if he was unconscious for too long, he would die. Kwon Dagon thought there was nothing else to see and thought that An Hagen was not immersed. Suddenly, An Hagen attacked Kwon Dagon from behind and caught him. He said that he was right. If he was unconscious for too long, he would die. Therefore, he will end it. Ham Sun Jin also explained that An Hagen has the nickname Anaconda. He wasn't given that nickname just because he was similar to his name. Whoever the opponent is, the anaconda will wrap around them and squeeze them. The more they squirm, the more the anaconda will squeeze, and the victim who is squeezed will not be able to move and will be eaten whole. An Hagen's flexible and muscular body is similar to a giant anaconda. No entangled prey can escape. But Lee Seong-hoon didn't think so. He had seen it before. An enormous anaconda wrapped around a jaguar. He thought the immobile jaguar would be eaten. However, looking at it from another angle, the anaconda's neck had already been gnawed off. Therefore, Lee Seong-hoon told him to pay attention clearly. See if the anaconda can protect its head well. Kwon Dagon grabbed An Hagen's collarbone and pulled, causing An Hagen pain. In Lee Seong-hoon's eyes, the anaconda's head had been bitten off. In front of An Hagen, Kwon Dagon said he had crossed the line. So he had no choice to cross the line either. Because Kwon Dagon tore her collarbone, Gu Seonghwa was sure it would cause semi-permanent shock. He thought that if he made a mistake too, he could end up like that. Ham Sun Jin couldn't believe this could happen. But Kwon Dagon also told Ham Sun Jin to immediately bring his friend. At the game center, the thug who scolded Chun Shim for being noisy is being scolded because he is also noisy. His friend intended to stop him, but he was stopped by his friend who knew who his opponent was. The man then said that because Chun Shim was cute, he could bark a little. The thug agreed and asked him to let go. Finally, the man approached Chun Shim, and Chun Shim complained because he was considered like a dog. But the man said he meant Chun Shim was really cute. Then he asked Chun Shim what he should do with them. He asks to just say it as he can even kill them. The man was one of the 4 executives, Bae Yowul.